Recorded Books presents an unabridged recording of Charmed Life by Diana Wynne Jones, narrated by Gerard Doyle.
Chapter 1. Cat Chant admired his elder sister Gwendolyn. She was a witch. He admired her, and he clung to her. Great changes came about in their lives, and left him no one else to cling to. The first great change came about when their parents took them out for a day trip down the river in a paddle steamer. They set out in great style, Gwendolyn and her mother in white dresses with ribbons, Cat and his father in prickly blue serge Sunday suits. It was a hot day. The steamer was crammed with other people in holiday clothes, talking, laughing, eating whelks with thin slices of white bread and butter, while the paddleboat steam organ wheezed out popular tunes so that no one could hear themselves talk. In fact, the steamer was too crowded and too old. Something went wrong with the steering. The whole laughing, whelk-eating, Sunday-dressed crowd was swept away in the current from the dam. They hit one of the posts, which was supposed to stop people being swept away, and the paddle steamer, being old, simply broke into pieces. Cat remembered the organ playing and the paddles beating the blue sky. Clouds of steam screamed from broken pipes and drowned the screams from the crowd as every single person aboard was swept away through the dam. It was a terrible accident. The papers called it the Saucy Nancy disaster. The ladies in their clinging skirts were quite unable to swim. The men in tight blue serge were very little better off. But Gwendolyn was a witch, so she could not drown. And Cat, who flung his arms around Gwendolyn when the boat hit the post, survived too. There were very few other survivors. The whole country was shocked by it. The paddleboat company and the town of Wolvercote between them paid for the funerals. Gwendolyn and Cat were given heavy black clothes at public expense and rode behind the procession of hearses in a carriage pulled by black horses with black plumes on their heads. The other survivors rode with them. Cat looked at them and wondered if they were witches and warlocks, but he never found out. The mayor of Wolvercote had set up a fund for the survivors. Money poured in from all over the country. All the other survivors took their share and went away to start new lives elsewhere. Only Cat and Gwendolyn were left, and since nobody could discover any of their relations, they stayed in Wolvercote. They became celebrities for a time. Everyone was very kind. Everyone said what beautiful little orphans they were. It was true. They were both fair and pale with blue eyes, and looked good in black. Gwendolyn was very pretty and tall for her age. Cat was small for his age. Gwendolyn was very motherly to Cat, and people were touched. Cat did not mind. It made up a little for the empty, lost way he was feeling. Ladies gave him cake and toys. Town councillors came and asked how he was getting on, and the mayor called and patted him on the head. The mayor explained that the money from the fund was being put into a trust for them until they were grown up. Meanwhile, the town would pay for their education and upbringing. "And where would you little people like to live?" he asked kindly. Gwendolyn at once said that old Mrs. Sharp downstairs had offered to take them in. "She's been ever so kind to us," she explained. "We'd love to live with her." Mrs. Sharp had been very kind. She was a witch too. The printed sign in her parlour window said, "Certified Witch," and interested in Gwendolyn. The mayor was a little dubious. Like all people who had no talent for witchcraft, he did not approve of those who had. He asked Cat how he felt about Gwendolyn's plan. Cat did not mind. He preferred living in the house he was used to, even if it was downstairs. Since the mayor felt that the two orphans ought to be made as happy as possible, he agreed. Gwendolyn and Cat moved in with Mrs. Sharp. Looking back on it, Cat supposed that it was from this time on that he was certain Gwendolyn was a witch. He had not been sure before. When he had asked his parents, they had shaken their heads, sighed, and looked unhappy. Cat had been puzzled, because he remembered the terrible trouble there had been when Gwendolyn gave him cramps. He could not see how his parents could blame Gwendolyn for it unless she truly was a witch. But all that was changed now. Mrs. Sharp made no secret of it. "You've a real talent for magic, dearie," she said, beaming at Gwendolyn, "and I wouldn't be doing my duty by you if I let it go to waste. We must see about a teacher for you right away. You could do worse than go to Mr. Nostrum next door for a start. He may be the worst necromancer in town, but he knows how to teach. He'll give you a good grounding, my love." Mr. Nostrum's charges for teaching magic turned out to be £1 an hour for the elementary grades and £1 an hour for the advanced grades beyond. Rather expensive, as Mrs. Sharp said. She put on her best hat with black beads and ran around to the town hall to see if the fund would pay for Gwendolyn's lessons. To her annoyance, the mayor refused. He told Mrs. Sharp that witchcraft was not part of an ordinary education. Mrs. Sharp came back, rattling the beads on her hat with irritation, and carrying a flat cardboard box the mayor had given her, full of the odds and ends the kind ladies had cleared out of Gwendolyn's parents' bedroom. "Blind prejudice," Mrs. Sharp said, dumping the box on the kitchen table. "If a person has a gift, they have a right to have it developed, and so I told him. But don't worry, dearie," she said, seeing that Gwendolyn was looking decidedly stormy. "There's a way around everything. Mr. Nostrum would teach you for nothing if we found the right thing to tempt him with. Let's have a look in this box. Your poor Ma and Pa may have left something that might be just the thing." Accordingly, Mrs. Sharp turned the box out onto the table. It was a queer collection of things, letters and lace and souvenirs. Cat did not remember having seen half of them before. There was a marriage certificate, saying that Francis John Chant had married Caroline Mary Chant 12 years ago at St. Margaret's Church, Wolvercote, and a withered nosegay his mother must have carried at the wedding. Underneath that, he found some glittery earrings he had never seen his mother wear. Mrs. Sharp's hat rattled as she bent swiftly over these. "Those are diamond earrings," she said. "Your Ma must have had money. Now, if I took those to Mr. Nostrum, but we'd get more for them if I took them round to Mr. Larkins." Mr. Larkins kept the junk shop on the corner of the street, except that it was not always exactly junk. Among the brass fenders and chipped crockery, you could find quite valuable things, and also a discreet notice saying "exotic supplies," which meant that Mr. Larkins also stocked bats' wings, dried newts, and other ingredients of magic. There was no question that Mr. Larkins would be very interested in a pair of diamond earrings. Mrs. Sharp's eyes pouched up, greedy and beady, as she put out her hand to pick up the earrings. Gwendolyn put out her hand for them at the same moment. She did not say anything. Neither did Mrs. Sharp. Both their hands stood still in the air. There was a feeling of fierce, invisible struggle. Then Mrs. Sharp took her hand away. "Thank you," Gwendolyn said coldly, and put the earrings away in the pocket of her black dress. "You see what I mean?" Mrs. Sharp said, making the best of it. "You have a real talent, dearie." She went back to sorting the other things in the box. She turned over an old pipe, ribbons, a spray of white heather, menus, concert tickets, and picked up a bundle of old letters. She ran her thumb down the edge of it. "Love letters," she said. "His to her." She put the bundle down without looking at it and picked up another. "Hers to him. No use." Cat, watching Mrs. Sharp's broad mauve thumb whirring down a third bundle of letters, thought that being a witch must save a great deal of time. "Business letters," said Mrs. Sharp. Her thumb paused and went slowly back up the pile again. "Now what have we here?" she said. She untied the pink tape from around the bundle and carefully took out 3 letters. She unfolded them. "Chrestomanci!" she exclaimed, and as soon as she said it, she clapped one hand over her mouth and mumbled behind it. Her face was red. Kat could see she was surprised, frightened and greedy, all at the same time. "Now what was he doing writing to your pa?" she said, as soon as she had recovered. "Let's see," said Gwendolyn. Mrs. Sharp spread the 3 letters out on the kitchen table, and Gwendolyn and Kat bent over them. The first thing that struck Kat was the energy of the signature on all 3. Chrestomanci. The next thing he saw was that 2 of the letters were written in the same energetic writing as the signature. The first was dated 12 years ago, soon after his parents had been married. It said, "Dear Frank, now don't get on your high horse. I only offered because I thought it might help. I still will help, in any way I can, if you let me know what I can do. I feel you have a claim on me. Yours ever, Chrestomanci." The second letter was shorter. "Dear Chant, the same to you. Go to blazes. Chrestomanci." The third letter was dated 6 years ago, and it was written by someone else. Chrestomanci had only signed it. "Sir, you were warned 6 years ago that something like what you relate might come to pass, and you made it quite clear that you wished for no help from this quarter. We are not interested in your troubles, nor is this a charitable institution. Chrestomanci." "What did your pa say to him?" Mrs. Sharp wondered, curious and awestruck. "Well, what do you think, dearie?" Gwendolyn held her hands spread out above the letters, rather as if she was warming them at a fire. Both her little fingers twitched. "I don't know. They feel important, especially the first one and the last one. Awfully important." "Who's Chrestomanci?" Kat asked. It was a hard name to say. He said it in pieces, trying to remember the way Mrs. Sharp had said it. Chrestomanci. "Is that the right way?" "Yes, that's right. And never you mind who he is, my love," said Mrs. Sharp. "And important's a weak word for it, dearie. I wish I knew what your pa had said. Something not many people would dare say by the sound of it. And look what he got in return. 3 genuine signatures. Mr. Nostrum would give his eyes for those, dearie. Oh, you're in luck. He'll teach you for those all right. So would any necromancer in the country." Gleefully, Mrs. Sharp began packing the things away in the box again. "What have we here?" A little red book of matches had fallen out of the bundle of business letters. Mrs. Sharp took it up carefully and, quite as carefully, opened it. It was less than half full of flimsy cardboard matches, but 3 of the matches had been burned without being torn out of the book first. The third one along was so very burned that Kat supposed it must have set light to the other 2. Said Mrs. Sharp. "I think you'd better keep this, dearie." She passed the little red book to Gwendolyn, who put it in the pocket of her dress along with the earrings. "And what about you having this, my love?" Mrs. Sharp said to Kat, remembering that he had a claim too. She gave him the spray of white heather. Kat wore it in his buttonhole until it fell to pieces. Living with Mrs. Sharp, Gwendolyn seemed to expand. Her hair seemed brighter gold, her eyes deeper blue, and her whole manner was glad and confident. Perhaps Kat contracted a little to make room for her. He did not know. Not that he was unhappy. Mrs. Sharp was quite as kind to him as she was to Gwendolyn. Town councillors and their wives called several times a week and patted him on the head in the parlour. They sent him and Gwendolyn to the best school in Wolvercote. Kat was happy there. The only drawback was that Kat was left-handed, and schoolmasters always punished him if they caught him writing with his left hand. But they did that at all the schools Cat had been to, and he was used to it. He had dozens of friends. All the same, at the heart of everything, he felt lost and lonely. So he clung to Gwendolyn, because she was the only family he had. Gwendolyn was often rather impatient with him, though usually she was too busy and happy to be downright cross. "Just leave me alone, Cat," she would say, "or else." Then she would pack exercise books into a music case and hasten next door for a lesson with Mr. Nostrum. Mr. Nostrum was delighted to teach Gwendolyn for the letters. Mrs. Sharp gave him one every term for a year, starting with the last. "Not all at once, in case he gets greedy," she said, "and we'll give him the best last." Gwendolyn made excellent progress. Such a promising witch was she, indeed, that she skipped the first grade magic exam and went straight on to the second. She took the third and fourth grades together just after Christmas, and by the following summer she was starting on advanced magic. Mr. Nostrum regarded her as his favourite pupil. He told Mrs. Sharp so over the wall, and Gwendolyn always came back from her lessons with him pleased and golden and glowing. She went to Mr. Nostrum 2 evenings a week with her magic case under her arm, just as many people might go to music lessons. In fact, music lessons were what Mrs. Sharp put Gwendolyn down as having on the account she kept for the town council. Since Mr. Nostrum never got paid, except by the letters, Cat thought this was rather dishonest of Mrs. Sharp. "I have to put something by for my old age," Mrs. Sharp told him crossly. "I don't get much for myself out of keeping you, do I? And I can't trust your sister to remember me when she's grown up and famous. Oh dear me, no. I've no illusions about that." Cat knew Mrs. Sharp was probably right. He was a little sorry for her, for she had certainly been kind, and he knew by now that she was not a very good witch herself. The certified witch, which the notice in Mrs. Sharp's parlour window claimed her to be, was in fact the very lowest qualification. People only came to Mrs. Sharp for charms when they could not afford the 3 accredited witches farther down the street. Mrs. Sharp eked out her earnings by acting as an agent for Mr. Larkins at the junk shop. She got him exotic supplies, that is to say, the stranger ingredients needed for spells from as far away as London. She was very proud of her contacts in London. "Oh, yes," she often said to Gwendolyn, "I've got the contacts, I have. I know those that can get me a pound of dragon's blood any time I ask, for all it's illegal. While you have me, you'll never be in need." Perhaps, in spite of having no illusions about Gwendolyn, Mrs. Sharp was really hoping to become Gwendolyn's manager when Gwendolyn grew up. Cat suspected she was, anyway. And he was sorry for Mrs. Sharp. He was sure that Gwendolyn would cast her off like an old coat when she became famous. Like Mrs. Sharp, Cat had no doubt that Gwendolyn would be famous. So he said, "There's me to look after you, though." He did not fancy the idea, but he felt he ought to say it. Mrs. Sharp was warmly grateful. As a reward, she arranged for Cat to have real music lessons. "Then that mayor will have nothing to complain of," she said. She believed in killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Cat started to learn the violin. He thought he was making good progress. He practiced diligently. He never could understand why the new people living upstairs always banged on the floor when he started to play. Mrs. Sharp, being tone-deaf herself, nodded and smiled while he played, and encouraged him greatly. He was practising away one evening when Gwendolyn stormed in and shrieked a spell in his face. Cat found to his dismay that he was holding a large striped cat by the tail. He had its head tucked under his chin, and he was sawing at its back with the violin bow. He dropped it hurriedly. Even so, it bit him under the chin and scratched him painfully. "What did you do that for?" he said. The cat stood in an arch, glaring at him. "Because that's just what it sounded like," said Gwendolyn. "I couldn't stand it a moment longer. Here, pussy, pussy." The cat did not like Gwendolyn either. It scratched the hand she held out to it. Gwendolyn smacked it. It ran away, with Cat in hot pursuit, shouting, "Stop it! That's my fiddle! Stop it!" But the cat escaped, and that was the end of the violin lessons. Mrs. Sharp was very impressed with this display of talent from Gwendolyn. She climbed on a chair in the yard and told Mr. Nostrum about it over the wall. From there, the story spread to every witch and necromancer in the neighbourhood. That neighbourhood was full of witches. People in the same trade liked to cluster together. If Cat came out of Mrs. Sharp's front door and turned right down Coven Street, he passed, besides the 3 accredited witches, 2 necromancy offords, a soothsayer, a diviner, and a willing warlock. If he turned left, he passed Mr. Henry Nostrum, ARCM, tuition in necromancy, a fortune-teller, a sorcery for all occasions, a clairvoyant, and lastly, Mr. Larkin's shop. The air in the street, and for several streets around, was heavy with the scent of magic being done. All these people took a great and friendly interest in Gwendolyn. The story of the cat impressed them enormously. They made a great pet of the creature. Naturally, it was called Fiddle. Though it remained bad-tempered, captious, and unfriendly, it never went short of food. They made an even greater pet of Gwendolyn. Mr. Larkins gave her presents. The willing warlock, who was a muscular young man always in need of a shave, popped out of his house whenever he saw Gwendolyn passing and presented her with a bullseye. The various witches were always looking out simple spells for her. Gwendolyn was very scornful of these spells. "Do they think I'm a baby or something? I'm miles beyond this stuff," she would say, casting the latest spell aside. Mrs. Sharp, who was glad of any aid to witchcraft, usually gathered the spell up carefully and hid it. But once or twice Cat found the odd spell lying about. Then he could not resist trying it. He would have liked to have had just a little of Gwendolyn's talent. He always hoped that he was a late developer and that someday a spell would work for him. But they never did. Not even the one for turning brass buttons to gold, which Cat particularly fancied. The various fortune-tellers gave Gwendolyn presents too. She got an old crystal ball from the diviner and a pack of cards from the soothsayer. The fortune-teller told her fortune for her. Gwendolyn came in golden and exultant from that. "I'm going to be famous! He said I could rule the world if I go the right way about it," she told Cat. Though Cat had no doubt that Gwendolyn would be famous, he could not see how she could rule the world, and he said so. "You'd only rule one country, even if you married the king," he objected. "And the Prince of Wales got married last year." "There are more ways of ruling than that, stupid," Gwendolyn retorted. "Mr. Nostrum has lots of ideas for me for a start. Mind you, there are some snags. There's a change for the worse that I have to surmount, and a dominant dark stranger. But when he told me I'd rule the world, my fingers all twitched, so I know it's true." There seemed no limit to Gwendolyn's glowing confidence. The next day, Miss Larkins, the clairvoyant, called Cat into her house and offered to tell his fortune too. Chapter 2. Cat was alarmed by Miss Larkins. She was the daughter of Mr. Larkins at the junk shop. She was young and pretty and fiercely red-headed. She wore the red hair piled into a bun on top of her head, from which red tendrils of hair escaped and tangled becomingly with earrings like hoops for parrots to sit on. She was a very talented clairvoyant, and until the story of the cat became known, Miss Larkins had been the pet of the neighbourhood. Cat remembered that even his mother had given Miss Larkins presents. Cat knew Miss Larkins was offering to tell his fortune out of jealousy of Gwendolyn. "No, thank you very much," he said, backing away from Miss Larkins' little table spread with objects of divination. "It's quite all right. I don't want to know." But Miss Larkins advanced on him and seized him by his shoulders. Cat squirmed. Miss Larkins used a scent that shrieked "Violets!" at him. Her earrings swung like manacles, and her corsets creaked when she was close to. "Silly boy," Miss Larkins said in her rich, melodious voice. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to know." But I don't," Cat said, twisting this way and that. "Hold still," said Miss Larkins, and tried to stare deep into Cat's eyes. Cat shut his eyes hastily. He squirmed harder than ever. He might have got loose had not Miss Larkins abruptly gone off into some kind of trance. Cat found himself being gripped with a strength that would have surprised him even in the willing warlock. He opened his eyes to find Miss Larkins staring blankly at him. Her body shook, creaking her corsets like old doors swinging in the wind. "Oh, please let go," Cat said. But Miss Larkins did not appear to hear. Cat took hold of the fingers gripping his shoulders and tried to prise them loose. He could not move them. After that, he could only stare helplessly at Miss Larkins' blank face. Miss Larkins opened her mouth, and quite a different voice came out. It was a man's voice, brisk and kindly. "You've taken a weight off my mind, lad," it said. It sounded pleased. "There'll be a big change coming up for you now. But you've been awfully careless. 4 gone already and only 5 left. You must take more care. You're in danger from at least 2 directions, did you know?" The voice stopped. By this time Cat was so frightened that he dared not move. He could only wait until Miss Larkins came to herself, yawned, and let go of him in order to cover her mouth elegantly with one hand. "There," she said in her usual voice. "That was it. What did I say?" Finding Miss Larkins had no idea what she had said brought Cat out in goose pimples. All he wanted to do was to run away. He dashed for the door. Miss Larkins pursued him, seized his arms again and shook him. Tell me, what did I say?" With the violence of her shaking, her red hair came down in sheets. Her corset sounded like bending planks. She was terrifying. "What voice did I use?" she demanded. A man's voice," Cat faltered. "Sort of nice and no nonsense about it." Miss Larkins seemed dumbfounded. "A man? Not Bobby or Doddo? Not a child's voice, I mean?" "No," said Cat. "How peculiar," said Miss Larkins. "I never use a man. What did he say?" Cat repeated what the voice had said. He thought he would never forget it if he lived to 90. It was some consolation to find that Miss Larkins was quite as puzzled by it as he was. "Well, I suppose it was a warning," she said dubiously. She also seemed disappointed. "And nothing else? Nothing about your sister?" "No, nothing," said Cat. "Oh, well, can't be helped," Miss Larkins said discontentedly, and she let go of Cat in order to put her hair up again. As soon as both her hands were safely occupied in pinning her bum, Cat ran. He shot out into the street, feeling very shaken. And he was caught by 2 more people almost at once. "Oh, here is young Eric Chant now," said Mr. Nostrum, advancing down the pavement. "You are acquainted with my brother William, are you, young Chant?" Cat was once more caught by an arm. He tried to smile. It was not that he disliked Mr. Nostrum. It was just that Mr. Nostrum always talked in this jocular way, and called him young Chant every few words, which made it very difficult to talk to Mr. Nostrum in return. Mr. Nostrum was small and plumpish, with 2 wings of grizzled hair. He had a cast in his left eye, too, which always stared out sideways. Cat found that added to the difficulty of talking to Mr. Nostrum. Was he looking and listening, or was his mind elsewhere with that wandering eye? Yes, I've met your brother," Cat reminded Mr. Nostrum. Mr. William Nostrum came to visit his brother regularly. Cat saw him almost once a month. He was quite a well-to-do wizard, with a practice in Eastbourne. Mrs. Sharp claimed that Mr. Henry Nostrum sponged on his wealthier brother, both for money and for spells that worked. Whatever the truth of that, Cat found Mr. William Nostrum even harder to talk to than his brother. He was half as large again as Mr. Henry, and always wore mourning dress with a huge silver watch chain across his tubby waistcoat. Otherwise he was the image of Mr. Henry Nostrum, except that both his eyes were out of true. Cat always wondered how Mr. William saw anything. "How do you do, sir?" he said to him politely. "Very well," said Mr. William, in a deep, gloomy voice, as if the opposite was true. Mr. Henry Nostrum glanced up at him apologetically. "The fact is, young Chant," he explained, "we have met with a little setback. My brother is upset." He lowered his voice, and his wandering eye wandered all around Cat's right side. "It's about those letters from you-know-who. We can find out nothing. It seems Gwendolyn knows nothing. Do you, young Chant, perchance know why your esteemed and lamented father should be acquainted with... let us call him the august personage who signed them?" "I haven't the faintest idea, I'm afraid," said Cat. "Could he have been some relation?" suggested Mr. Henry Nostrum. "Chant is a good name." "I think it must be a bad name, too," Cat answered. "We haven't any relations." "But what of your dear mother?" persisted Mr. Nostrum, his odd eye travelling away while his brother managed to stare gloomily at the pavement and the rooftops at once. "You can see the poor boy knows nothing, Henry," Mr. William said. "I doubt if he would be able to tell us his dear mother's maiden name." "Oh, I do know that," said Cat. "It's on the marriage lines. She was called Chant, too." "Odd," said Mr. Nostrum, swirling an eye at his brother. "Odd and peculiarly unhelpful," Mr. William agreed. Cat wanted to get away. He felt he had taken enough strange questions to last till Christmas. "Well, if you want to know that badly," he said, "why don't you write and ask Mr. "Hush!" said Mr. Henry Nostrum violently. Said his brother, almost equally violently. "August personage, I mean," Cat said, looking at Mr. William in alarm. Mr. William's eyes had gone right to the sides of his face. Cat was afraid he might be going off into a trance, like Miss Larkins. "It will serve, Henry, it will serve," Mr. William cried out, and with great triumph he lifted the silver watch chain off his middle and shook it. "Then for silver!" he cried. "I'm so glad," Cat said politely. "I have to be going now." He ran off down the street as fast as he could. When he went out that afternoon, he took care to turn right and go out of Coven Street past the Willing Warlock's house. It was rather a nuisance, since that was the long way around to where most of his friends lived, but anything was better than meeting Miss Larkins or the Nostrums again. It was almost enough to make Cat wish that school had started. When Cat came home that evening, Gwendolyn was just back from her lesson with Mr. Nostrum. She had her usual glowing, exulting look, but she was looking secretive and important too. "That was a good idea of yours, writing to Chrestomanci," she said to Cat. "I can't think why I didn't think of it. Anyway, I just have." "Why did you do it? Couldn't Mr. Nostrum?" Cat asked. "It came more naturally from me," said Gwendolyn. "And I suppose it doesn't matter if he gets my signature. Mr. Nostrum told me what to write." "Why does he want to know, anyway?" Cat said. "Wouldn't you like to know?" Gwendolyn said exultingly. "No," said Cat, "I wouldn't." Since this had brought what happened that morning into his mind, which still made him almost wish the autumn term had started, he said, "I wish the horse-chestnuts were ripe." "Horse-chestnuts?" Gwendolyn said in the greatest disgust. "What a low mind you have. They won't be ready for a good 6 weeks." "I know," said Cat. And for the next 2 days he carefully turned right every time he left the house. They were the lovely golden days that happen when August is passing into September. Cat and his friends went out along the river. On the second day they found a wall and climbed it. There was an orchard beyond, and here they were lucky enough to discover a tree loaded with sweet white apples, the kind that ripen early. They filled their pockets and then their hats. Then a furious gardener chased them with a rake. They ran. Cat was very happy as he carried his full knobby hat home. Mrs. Sharp loved apples. He just hoped she would not reward him by making gingerbread men. As a rule, gingerbread men were fun. They leaped up off the plate and ran when you tried to eat them, so that when you finally caught them you felt quite justified in eating them. It was a fair fight, and some got away. But Mrs. Sharp's gingerbread men never did that. They simply lay, feebly waving their arms, and Cat never had the heart to eat them. Cat was so busy thinking of all this that though he noticed a 4-wheel cab standing in the road as he turned the corner by the Willing Warlock's house, he paid no attention to it. He went to the side door and burst into the kitchen with his hat full of apples, shouting, "I say, look what I've got, Mrs. Sharp!" Mrs. Sharp was not there. Instead, standing in the middle of the kitchen, was a tall and quite extraordinarily well-dressed man. Cat stared at him in some dismay. He was clearly a rich new town councillor. Nobody but those kind of people wore trousers with such pearly stripes, or coats of such beautiful velvet, or carried tall hats as shiny as their boots. The man's hair was dark. It was smooth as his hat. Cat had no doubt that this was Gwendolyn's dark stranger, come to help her start ruling the world. And he should not have been in the kitchen at all. Visitors were always taken straight to the parlour. "Oh, how do you do, sir? Will you come this way, sir?" he gasped. The dark stranger gave him a wondering look. And well he might, Cat thought, looking around distractedly. The kitchen was in its usual mess. The range was all ash. On the table, Cat saw to his further dismay, Mrs. Sharp had been making gingerbread men. The ingredients for the spell lay on one end of the table, all grubby newspaper packets and seedy little jars, and the gingerbread itself was strewn over the middle of the table. At the far end, the flies were gathering around the meat for lunch, which looked nearly as messy as the spell. "Who are you?" said the dark stranger. "I have a feeling I should know you. What have you got in your hat?" Cat was too busy staring around to attend properly, but he caught the last question. His pleasure returned. "Apples," he said, showing the stranger. "Lovely sweet ones. I've been scrumping." The stranger looked grave. "Scrumping," he said, "is a form of stealing." Cat knew that as well as he did. He thought it was very joyless even for a town councillor to point it out. "I know, but I bet you did it when you were my age." The stranger coughed slightly and changed the subject. "You haven't said yet who you are." "Sorry, didn't I?" said Cat. "I'm Eric Chant, only they always call me Cat." "Then is Gwendolyn Chant your sister?" the stranger asked. He was looking more and more austere and pitying. Cat suspected that he thought Mrs. Sharp's kitchen was a den of vice. "That's right. Won't you come this way?" Cat said, hoping to get the stranger out of it. "It's neater through here." "I had a letter from your sister," the stranger said, standing where he was. "She gave me the impression you had drowned with your parents." "You must have made a mistake," Cat said distractedly. "I didn't drown because I was holding on to Gwendolyn, and she's a witch. It's cleaner through here." "I see," said the stranger. "I'm called Chrestomanci, by the way." "Oh," said Cat. This was a real crisis. He put his hat of apples down in the middle of the spell, which he very much hoped would ruin it. "Then you've got to come in the parlour at once." "Why?" said Chrestomanci, sounding rather bewildered. "Because," said Cat, thoroughly exasperated, "you're far too important to stay here." "What makes you think I'm important?" Chrestomanci asked, still bewildered. Cat was beginning to want to shake him. "You must be. You're wearing important clothes, and Mrs. Sharp said you were. She said Mr. Nostrum would give his eyes just for your 3 letters. "Has Mr. Nostrum given his eyes for my letters?" asked Chrestomanci. "It hardly seems worth it." "No, he just gave Gwendolyn lessons for them," said Cat. "What, for his eyes? How uncomfortable," said Chrestomanci. Fortunately, there were thumping footsteps just then, and Gwendolyn burst in through the kitchen door, panting, golden and jubilant. "Mr. Chrestomanci!" "Just Chrestomanci," said the stranger. "Yes. Would you be Gwendolyn?" "Yes, Mr. Nostrum told me there was a cab here," gasped Gwendolyn. She was followed by Mrs. Sharp, nearly as breathless. The two of them took over the conversation, and Cat was thankful for it. Chrestomanci at last consented to be taken to the parlour, where Mrs. Sharp deferentially offered him a cup of tea and a plate of her weekly waving gingerbread men. Chrestomanci, Cat was interested to see, did not seem to have the heart to eat them either. He drank a cup of tea, austerely, without milk or sugar, and asked questions about how Gwendolyn and Cat came to be living with Mrs. Sharp. Mrs. Sharp tried to give the impression that she looked after them for nothing, out of the goodness of her heart. She hoped Chrestomanci might be induced to pay her for their keep, as well as the town council. But Gwendolyn had decided to be radiantly honest. "The town pays," she said, "because everyone's so sorry about the accident." Cat was glad she had explained, even though he suspected that Gwendolyn might already be casting Mrs. Sharp off like an old coat. "Then I must go and speak to the mayor," Chrestomanci said, and he stood up, dusting his splendid hat on his elegant sleeve. Mrs. Sharp sighed and sagged. She knew what Gwendolyn was doing too. "Don't be anxious, Mrs. Sharp," said Chrestomanci. "No one wishes you to be out of pocket." Then he shook hands with Gwendolyn and Cat and said, "I should have come to see you before, of course. Forgive me. Your father was so infernally rude to me, you see. I'll see you again, I hope." Then he went away in his cab, leaving Mrs. Sharp very sour, Gwendolyn jubilant, and Cat nervous. "Why are you so happy?" Cat asked Gwendolyn. "Because he was touched at our orphan state," said Gwendolyn. "He's going to adopt us. My fortune is made." "Don't talk such nonsense," snapped Mrs. Sharp. "Your fortune is the same as it ever was. He may have come here in all his finery, but he said nothing, and he promised nothing." Gwendolyn smiled confidently. "You didn't see the heart-wringing letter I wrote." Maybe, but he's not got a heart to wring, Mrs. Sharp retorted. Cat rather agreed with Mrs. Sharp, particularly as he had an uneasy feeling that before Gwendolyn and Mrs. Sharp arrived, he had somehow managed to offend Chrestomanci as badly as his father once did. He hoped Gwendolyn would not realise that. He knew she would be furious with him. But, to his astonishment, Gwendolyn proved to be right. The mayor called that afternoon and told them that Chrestomanci had arranged for Cat and Gwendolyn to come and live with him as part of his own family. "And I see I needn't tell you what lucky little people you are," he said, as Gwendolyn uttered a shriek of joy and hugged the dour Mrs. Sharp. Cat felt more nervous than ever. He tugged the mayor's sleeve. "If you please, sir, I don't understand who Chrestomanci is." The mayor patted him kindly on the head. "A very eminent gentleman," he said. "You'll be hobnobbing with all the crowned heads of Europe before long, my boy. What do you think of that, eh?" Cat did not know what to think. This had told him precisely nothing, and made him more nervous than ever. He supposed Gwendolyn must have written a very touching letter indeed. So the second great change came about in Cat's life, and very dismal he feared it would be. All that next week, while they were hurrying about being bought new clothes by councillors' wives, and while Gwendolyn grew more and more excited and triumphant, Cat found he was missing Mrs. Sharp and everyone else, even Miss Larkins, as if he had already left them. When the time came for them to get on the train, the town gave them a splendid send-off with flags and a brass band. It upset Cat. He sat tensely on the edge of his seat, fearing he was in for a time of strangeness, and maybe even misery. Gwendolyn, however, spread out her smart new dress and arranged her nice new hat becomingly, and sank elegantly back in her seat. "I did it!" she said joyously. "Cat, isn't it marvellous?" "No," Cat said miserably. "I'm homesick already. What have you done? Why do you keep being so happy?" "You wouldn't understand," said Gwendolyn, "but I'll tell you part of it. I've got out of Dead and Alive Wolvercote at last, stupid councillors and piffling necromancers. And Chrestomanci was bowled over by me. You saw that, didn't you?" "I didn't notice specially," said Cat. "I mean, I saw you were being nice to him." "Oh, shut up, or I'll give you worse than cramps," said Gwendolyn. And as the train at last chuffed and began to draw out of the station, Gwendolyn waved her gloved hand to the brass band, up and down, just like royalty. Cat realised she was setting out to rule the world. Chapter 3. The train journey lasted about an hour, before the train puffed into Bow Bridge, where they were to get out. "It's frightfully small," Gwendolyn said critically. "Bow Bridge!" shouted a porter, running along the platform. "Bow Bridge! The young chance alight here, please." "Young chance?" Gwendolyn said disdainfully. "Can't they treat me with more respect?" All the same, the attention pleased her. Cat could see that, as she drew on her ladylike gloves, she was shaking with excitement. He cowered behind her as they got out and watched their trunks being tossed out onto the windy platform. Gwendolyn marched up to the shouting porter. "We are the young chance," she told him magnificently. It fell a little flat. The porter simply beckoned and scurried away to the entrance lobby, which was windier even than the platform. Gwendolyn had to hold her hat on. Here, a young man strode toward them in a billow of flapping coat. "We are the young chance," Gwendolyn told him. "Gwendolyn and Eric, pleased to meet you," said the young man. "I'm Michael Saunders. I'll be tutoring you with the other children." "Other children?" Gwendolyn asked him haughtily. But Mr. Saunders was evidently one of those people who are not good at standing still. He had already darted off to see about their trunks. Gwendolyn was a trifle annoyed. But when Mr. Saunders came back and led them outside into the station yard, they found a motor car waiting, long, black and sleek. Gwendolyn forgot her annoyance. She felt this was entirely fitting. Cat wished it had been a carriage. The car jerked and thrummed and smelled of petrol. He felt sick almost at once. He felt sicker still when they left Bow Bridge and thrummed along a winding country road. The only advantage he could see was that the car went very quickly. After only 10 minutes, Mr. Saunders said, "Look, there's Chrestomanci Castle now. You get the best view from here." Cat turned his sick face, and Gwendolyn her fresh one, the way he pointed. The castle was grey and turreted on the opposite hill. As the road turned, they saw it had a new part, with a spread of big windows and a flag flying above. They could see grand trees, dark layered cedars and big elms, and glimpse lawns and flowers. "It looks marvellous," Cat said sickly, rather surprised that Gwendolyn had said nothing. He hoped the road did not wind too much in getting to the castle. It did not. The car flashed around a village green and between big gates. Then there was a long tree-lined avenue, with the great door of the old part of the castle at the end of it. The car scrunched around on the gravel sweep in front of it. Gwendolyn leaned forward eagerly, ready to be first one out. It was clear there would be a butler, and perhaps footmen too. She could hardly wait to make her grand entry. But the car went on, past the grey knobbly walls of the old castle, and stopped at an obscure door where the new part began. It was almost a secretive door. There was a mass of rhododendron trees hiding it from both parts of the castle. "I'm taking you in this way," Mr. Saunders explained cheerfully, "because it's the door you'll be using mostly, and I thought it would help you find your way about if you start as you mean to go on." Cat did not mind. He thought this door looked more homely. But Gwendolyn, cheated of her grand entry, threw Mr. Saunders a seething look and wondered whether to say a most unpleasant spell at him. She decided against it. She was still wanting to give a good impression. They got out of the car and followed Mr. Saunders, whose coat had a way of billowing even when there was no wind, into a square, polished passageway indoors. A most imposing lady was waiting there to meet them. She was wearing a tight purple dress, and her hair was in a very tall jet-black pile. Cat thought she must be Mrs. Chrestomanci. "This is Miss Bessemer, the housekeeper," said Mr. Saunders. "Eric and Gwendolyn, Miss Bessemer. Eric's a bit carsick, I'm afraid." Cat had not realized his trouble was so obvious. He was embarrassed. Gwendolyn, who was very annoyed to be met by a mere housekeeper, held her hand out coldly to Miss Bessemer. Miss Bessemer shook hands like an empress. Cat was just thinking she was the most awe-inspiring lady he had ever met when she turned to him with a very kind smile. "Poor Eric," she said. "Riding in a car bothers me ever so too. You'll be all right now you're out of the thing, but if you're not, I'll give you something for it. Come and get washed, and have a look-see at your rooms." They followed the narrow purple triangle of her dress up some stairs, along corridors, and up more stairs. Cat had never seen anywhere so luxurious. There was carpet the whole way, a soft green carpet like grass in the dewy morning, and the floor at the sides was polished so that it reflected the carpet and the clean white walls and the pictures hung on the walls. Everywhere was very quiet. They heard nothing the whole way except their own feet and Miss Bessemer's purple rustle. Miss Bessemer opened a door onto a blaze of afternoon sun. "This is your room, Gwendolyn. Your bathroom opens off it." "Thank you," said Gwendolyn, and she sailed magnificently in to take possession of it. Kat peeped past Miss Bessemer and saw the room was very big, with a rich, soft turkey carpet covering most of the floor. Miss Bessemer said, "The family dines early when there are no visitors, so that they can eat with the children. But I expect you'd like some tea all the same. Whose room shall I have it sent to?" "Mine, please," Gwendolyn said at once. There was a short pause before Miss Bessemer said, "Well, that's settled then, isn't it? Your room is up here, Eric." The way was up a twisting staircase. Kat was pleased. It looked as if his room was going to be part of the old castle, and he was right. When Miss Bessemer opened the door, the room beyond was round, and the 3 windows showed that the wall was nearly 3 feet thick. Kat could not resist racing across the glowing carpet to scramble on one of the deep window seats and look out. He found he could see across the flat tops of the cedars to a great lawn like a sheet of green velvet, with flower gardens going down the hillside in steps beyond it. Then he looked around the room itself. The curved walls were whitewashed, and so was the thick fireplace. The bed had a patchwork quilt on it. There was a table, a chest of drawers, and a bookcase, with interesting-looking books in it. "Oh, I like this," he said to Miss Bessemer. "I'm afraid your bathroom is down the passage," said Miss Bessemer, as if this was a drawback. But as Kat had never had a private bathroom before, he did not mind in the least. As soon as Miss Bessemer had gone, he hastened along to have a look at it. To his awe, there were 3 sizes of red towel and a sponge as big as a melon. The bath had feet like a lion's. One corner of the room was tiled and with red rubber curtains for a shower. Kat could not resist experimenting. The bathroom was rather wet by the time he had finished. He went back to his room, a little damp himself. His trunk and box were there by this time, and a maid with red hair was unpacking them. She told Kat her name was Mary, and wanted to know if she was putting things in the right places. She was perfectly pleasant, but Kat was very shy of her. The red hair reminded him of Miss Larkins, and he could not think what to say to her. May I go down and have some tea?" he stammered. "Please yourself," she said, rather coldly, Kat thought. He ran downstairs again, feeling he might have gotten off on the wrong foot with her. Gwendolyn's trunk was standing in the middle of her room. Gwendolyn herself was sitting in a very queenly way at a round table by the window, with a big pewter teapot in front of her, a plate of brown bread and butter, and a plate of biscuits. "I told the girl I'd unpack for myself," she said. "I've got secrets in my trunk and my box. And I asked her to bring tea at once because I'm starving. And just look at it. Did you ever see anything so dull? Not even jam." "Perhaps the biscuits are nice," Kat said hopefully. But they were not. Or not particularly. "We shall starve in the midst of luxury," sighed Gwendolyn. Her room was certainly luxurious. The wallpaper seemed to be made of blue velvet. The top and bottom of the bed was upholstered like a chair in blue velvet with buttons in it, and the blue velvet bedspread matched it exactly. The chairs were painted gold. There was a dressing table fit for a princess, with little golden drawers, gold-backed brushes, and a long oval mirror surrounded by a gilded wreath. Gwendolyn admitted that she liked the dressing table, though she was not so sure about the wardrobe, which had painted garlands and maypole dancers on it. "It's to hang clothes in, not to look at," she said. "It distracts me. But the bathroom is lovely." The bathroom was tiled with blue and white tiles, and the bath was sunk down into the tiled floor. Over it, draped like a baby's cradle, were blue curtains for when you wanted a shower. The towels matched the tiles. Cat preferred his own bathroom, but that may have been because he had to spend rather a long time in Gwendolyn's. Gwendolyn locked him in it while she unpacked. Through the hiss of the shower, Gwendolyn had only herself to blame that she found her bathroom thoroughly soaked afterwards. Cat heard her voice raised in annoyance at someone who had come in to take the dull tea away and caught her with her trunk open. When Gwendolyn finally unlocked the bathroom door, she was still angry. "I don't think the servants here are very civil," she said. "If that girl says one thing more, she'll find herself with a boil on her nose, even if her name is Euphemia. Though," Gwendolyn added charitably, "I'm inclined to think being called Euphemia is punishment enough for anyone. You have to go and get your new suit on, Cat. She says dinner's in half an hour, and we have to change for it. Did you ever hear anything so formal and unnatural?" "I thought you were looking forward to that kind of thing," said Cat, who most certainly was not. "You can be grand and natural," Gwendolyn retorted. But the thought of the coming grandeur soothed her all the same. "I shall wear my blue dress with the lace collar," she said. "And I do think being called Euphemia is a heavy enough burden for anyone to bear, however rude they are." As Cat went up his winding stair, the castle filled with a mysterious booming. It was the first noise he had heard. It alarmed him. He learned later that it was the dressing gong to warn the family that they had half an hour to change in. Cat, of course, did not take nearly that time to put his suit on, so he had yet another shower. He felt damp and weak and almost washed out of existence by the time the maid, who was so unfortunate in being called Euphemia, came to take him and Gwendolyn downstairs to the drawing-room, where the family was waiting. Gwendolyn, in her pretty blue dress, sailed in confidently. Cat crept behind. The room seemed full of people. Cat had no idea how all of them came to be part of the family. There was an old lady in lace mittens, and a small man with large eyebrows and a loud voice who was talking about stocks and shares. Mr. Saunders, whose wrists and ankles were too long for his shiny black suit, and at least 2 younger ladies, and at least 2 younger men. Cat saw Chrestomanci, quite splendid in very dark red velvet, and Chrestomanci saw Cat and Gwendolyn, and looked at them with a vague, perplexed smile, which made Cat quite sure that Chrestomanci had forgotten who they were. "Oh," said Chrestomanci, "this is my wife." They were ushered in front of a plump lady with a mild face. She had a gorgeous lace dress on. Gwendolyn's eyes swept up and down it with considerable awe, but otherwise she was one of the most ordinary ladies they had ever seen. She gave them a friendly smile. "Eric and Gwendolyn, isn't it? You must call me Millie, my dears." This was a relief, because neither of them had any idea what they should have called her. "And now you must meet my Julia and my Roger," she said. 2 plump children came and stood beside her. They were both rather pale and had a tendency to breathe heavily. The girl wore a lace dress like her mother's, and the boy had on a blue velvet suit, but no clothes could disguise the fact that they were even more ordinary-looking than their mother. They looked politely at Gwendolyn and at Cat, and all 4 said, "How do you do?" Then there seemed nothing else to say. Luckily, they had not stood there long before a butler came and opened the double doors at the end of the room and told them that dinner was served. Gwendolyn looked at this butler in great indignation. "Why didn't he open the door to us?" she whispered to Cat, as they all went in a ragged sort of procession to the dining-room. "Why were we fobbed off with the housekeeper?" Cat did not answer. He was too busy clinging to Gwendolyn. They were being arranged around a long, polished table, and if anyone had tried to put Cat in a chair that was not next to Gwendolyn's, he thought he would have fainted from terror. Luckily, no one tried. Even so, the meal was terrifying enough. Footmen kept pushing delicious food in silver plates over Cat's left shoulder, Each time that happened, it took Cat by surprise, and he jumped and jogged the plate. He was supposed to help himself off the silver plate, and he never knew how much he was allowed to take. But the worst difficulty was that he was left-handed. The spoon and fork that he was supposed to lift the food with from the footman's plate to his own were always the wrong way around. He tried changing them over and dropped a spoon. He tried leaving them as they were and spilled gravy. The footman always said, "Not to worry, sir," and made him feel worse than ever. The conversation was even more terrifying. At one end of the table, the small, loud man talked endlessly of stocks and shares. At Cat's end, they talked about art. Mr. Saunders seemed to have spent the summer travelling abroad. He had seen statues and paintings all over Europe and much admired them. He was so eager that he slapped the table as he talked. He spoke of studios and schools, Quattrocento, and Dutch interiors until Cat's head went around. Cat looked at Mr. Saunders' thin, square-cheeked face and marvelled at all the knowledge behind it. Then Milly and Chrestomanci joined in. Milly recited a string of names Cat had never heard in his life before. Chrestomanci made comments on them as if these names were intimate friends of his. Whatever the rest of the family was like, Cat thought, Chrestomanci was not ordinary. He had very black, bright eyes, which were striking even when he was looking vague and dreamy. When he was interested, as he was about art, the black eyes screwed up in a way that seemed to spill the brightness of them over the rest of his face. And to Cat's dismay, the two children were equally interested. They kept up a mild chirp, as if they actually knew what their parents were talking about. Cat felt crushingly ignorant. What with this talk and the trouble over the suddenly appearing silver plates and the dull biscuits he had eaten for tea, he found he had no appetite at all. He had to leave half his ice cream pudding. He envied Gwendolyn for being able to sit so calmly and scornfully, enjoying her food. It was over at last. They were allowed to escape up to her upholstered bed with a bounce. "What a childish trick," she said. "They were showing off just to make us feel small. Mr. Nostrum warned me they would. It's to disguise the thinness of their souls. What an awful, dull wife. And did you ever see anyone so plain and stupid as those two children? I know I'm going to hate it here. This castle's crushing me already." "It may not be so bad once we get used to it," Cat said, without hope. "It'll be worse," Gwendolyn promised him. "There's something about this castle. It's a bad influence and a deadness. It's squashing the life and the witchcraft out of me. I can hardly breathe." "You're imagining things," said Cat, "because you want to be back with Mrs. Sharp." And he sighed. He missed Mrs. Sharp badly. "No, I'm not imagining it," said Gwendolyn. "I should have thought it was strong enough even for you to feel. Go on, try. Can't you feel the deadness?" Cat did not really need to try to see what she meant. There was something strange about the castle. He had thought it was simply that it was so quiet. But it was more than that. There was a softness to the atmosphere, a weightiness, as if everything they said or did was muffled under a great feather quilt. Normal sounds, like their two voices, seemed thin. There were no echoes to them. "Yes, it is queer," he agreed. "It's more than queer, it's terrible," said Gwendolyn. "I shall be lucky if I survive." Then she added, to Cat's surprise, "So I'm not sorry I came." "I am," said Cat. "Oh, you would need looking after," said Gwendolyn. "All right, there's a pack of cards on the dressing table. They're for divination, really, but if we take the trumps out, we can use them to play snap with if you like."
This ends Disc 1. Charmed Life, Disc 2.
Chapter 4. The same softness and silence were there when the red-haired Mary woke Cat the next morning and told him it was time to get up. Bright morning sunshine was flooding the curved walls of his room. Though Cat knew now that the castle must be full of people, he could hear not a sound from any of them. Nor could he hear anything from outside the windows. "I know what it's like," Cat thought. "It's like when it snowed in the night." The idea made him feel so pleased and so warm that he went to sleep again. "You really must get up, Eric," Mary said, shaking him. "I've run your bath, and your lessons start at 9. Make haste, or you won't have time for breakfast." Cat got up. He had so strong a feeling that it had snowed in the night that he was quite surprised to find his room warm in the sun. He looked out of the windows, and there were green lawns and flowers, and rooks circling the green trees, as if there had been some mistake. Mary had gone. Cat was glad, because he was not at all sure he liked her, and he was afraid of missing breakfast. When he was dressed, he went along to the bathroom and let the hot water out of the bath. Then he dashed down the twisting stairs to find Gwendolyn. "Where do we go for breakfast?" he asked her anxiously. Gwendolyn was never at her best in the morning. She was sitting on her blue velvet stool in front of her garlanded mirror, crossly combing her golden hair. Combing her hair was another thing which always made her cross. "I don't know and I don't care. Shut up," she said. "No, that's no way to speak," said the maid called Euphemia, briskly following Cat into the room. She was rather a pretty girl, and she did not seem to find her name the burden it should have been. "We're waiting to give you breakfast along here. Come on." Gwendolyn hurled her comb down expressively, and they followed Euphemia to a room just along the corridor. It was a square, airy room, with a row of big windows, but compared with the rest of the castle it was rather shabby. The leather chairs were battered, the grassy carpet had stains on it. None of the cupboards would shut properly. Things like clockwork trains and tennis rackets bulged out. Julia and Roger were sitting waiting at a table by the windows, in clothes as shabby as the room. Mary, who was waiting there too, said, "And about time," and began to work an interesting lift in the cupboard by the fireplace. There was a clank. Mary opened the lift and fetched out a large plate of bread and butter and a steaming brown jug of cocoa. She brought these over to the table, and Euphemia poured each child a mug of the cocoa. Gwendolyn stared from her mug to the plate of bread. "Is this all there is?" "What else do you want?" asked Euphemia. Gwendolyn could not find words to express what she wanted. Porridge, bacon and eggs, grapefruit, toast and kippers all occurred to her at once, and she went on staring. "Make up your mind," Euphemia said at last. "My breakfast's waiting for me too, you know." "Isn't there any marmalade?" said Gwendolyn. Euphemia and Mary looked at one another. "Julia and Roger are not allowed marmalade," Mary said. "Nobody forbade me to have it," said Gwendolyn. "Get me some marmalade at once." Mary went to a speaking tube by the lift, and after much rumbling and another clank, a pot of marmalade arrived. Mary brought it and put it in front of Gwendolyn. "Thank you," Cat said fervently. He felt as strongly about it as Gwendolyn, more, in fact, because he hated cocoa. "Oh, no trouble, I'm sure," Mary said, in what was certainly a sarcastic way, and the two maids went out. For a while, nobody said anything. Then Roger said to Cat, "Pass the marmalade, please." "You're not supposed to have it," said Gwendolyn, whose temper had not improved. "Nobody will know if I use one of your knives," Roger said placidly. Cat passed him the marmalade and his knife too. Why aren't you allowed it?" Julia and Roger looked at one another in a mild, secretive way. "We're too fat," Julia said, calmly taking the knife and the marmalade after Roger had done with them. Cat was not surprised when he saw how much marmalade they had managed to pile on their bread. Marmalade stood on both slices like a sticky brown cliff. Gwendolyn looked at them with disgust, and then, rather complacently, down at her trim linen dress. The contrast was certainly striking. "Your father is such a handsome man," she said. "It must be such a disappointment to him that you're both pudgy and plain, like your mother." The two children looked at her placidly over their cliffs of marmalade. "Oh, I wouldn't know," said Roger. "Pudgy is comfortable," said Julia. "It must be a nuisance to look like a china doll the way you do." Gwendolyn's blue eyes glared. She made a small sign under the edge of the table. The bread and thick marmalade whisked itself from Julia's hands and slapped itself on Julia's face, marmalade side inward. Julia gasped a little. "How dare you insult me?" said Gwendolyn. Julia peeled the bread slowly off her face and then fumbled out a handkerchief. Cat supposed she was going to wipe her face, but she let the marmalade stay where it was, trundling in blobs down her plump cheeks, and simply tied a knot in the handkerchief. She pulled the knot slowly tight, looking meaningly at Gwendolyn while she did so. With the final pull, the half-full jug of cocoa shot steaming into the air. It hovered for a second, and then shot sideways to hang just above Gwendolyn's head. Then it began to joggle itself into tipping position. "Stop it!" gasped Gwendolyn. She put up a hand to ward the jug off. The jug dodged her and went on tipping. Gwendolyn made another sign and gasped out strange words. The jug took not the slightest notice. It went on tipping until cocoa was brimming in the very end of its spout. Gwendolyn tried to lean out sideways away from it. The jug simply joggled along in the air until it was hanging over her head again. "Shall I make it pour?" Julia asked. There was a bit of a smile under the marmalade. "You dare!" screamed Gwendolyn. "I'll tell Chrestomanci on you! Oh!" She sat up straight again, and the jug followed her faithfully. Gwendolyn made another grab at it, and it dodged again. "Careful, you'll make it spill. And what a shame about your pretty dress," Roger said, watching complacently. "Shut up, you!" Gwendolyn shouted at him, leaning out the other way so that she was nearly in Cat's lap. Cat looked up nervously as the jug came and hovered over him too. It seemed to be going to pour. But at that moment the door opened and Chrestomanci came in, wearing a flowered silk dressing gown. It was a red and purple dressing gown, with gold at the neck and sleeves. It made Chrestomanci look amazingly tall, amazingly thin, and astonishingly stately. He could have been an emperor, or a particularly severe bishop. He was smiling as he came in, but the smile vanished when he saw the jug. The jug tried to vanish too. It fled back to the table at the sight of him, so quickly that cocoa slopped out of it onto Gwendolyn's dress, which may or may not have been an accident. Julia and Roger both looked stricken. Julia unknotted her handkerchief as if for dear life. "Well, I was coming in to say good morning," Chrestomanci said, "but I see that it isn't." He looked from the jug to Julia's marmalade-glistening cheeks. "If you two ever want to eat marmalade again," he said, "you'd better do as you're told. And the same goes for all four of you." "I wasn't doing anything wrong," Gwendolyn said, as if butter, not to speak of marmalade, would not have melted in her mouth. "Yes, you were," said Roger. Chrestomanci came to the end of the table and stood looking down on them, with his hands in the pockets of his noble robe. He looked so tall like that Cat was surprised that his head was still under the ceiling. "There's one absolute rule in this castle," he said, "which it will pay you all to remember. No witchcraft of any kind is to be practiced by children unless Michael Saunders is here to supervise you. Have you understood, Gwendolyn?" "Yes," said Gwendolyn. She gripped her lips together and clenched her hands, but she was still shaking with rage. "I refuse to keep such a silly rule." Chrestomanci did not seem to hear, or to notice how angry she was. He turned to Cat. "Have you understood too, Eric?" "Me?" said Cat in surprise. "Yes, of course." "Good," said Chrestomanci. "Now I will say good morning." "Good morning, Daddy," said Julia and Roger. Good morning," Cat said. Gwendolyn pretended not to hear. Two could play at that game. Chrestomanci smiled and swept out of the room like a very long procession of one person. "Telltale," Gwendolyn said to Roger as soon as the door had shut. "And that was a dirty trick with that jug. You were both doing it, weren't you?" Roger smiled sleepily, not in the least disturbed. "Witchcraft runs in our family," he said. "And we've both inherited it," said Julia. "I must go and wash." She picked up 3 slices of bread to keep her going while she did so, and left the room, calling over her shoulder, "Tell Michael I won't be long, Roger." "More cocoa?" Roger said politely, picking up the jug. "Yes, please," said Cat. It never bothered him to eat or drink things that had been bewitched, and he was thirsty. He thought that if he filled his mouth with marmalade and strained the cocoa through it, he might not taste the cocoa. Gwendolyn, however, was sure Roger was trying to insult her. She flounced around in her chair and stayed haughtily looking at the wall, until Mr. Saunders suddenly threw open a door Cat had not noticed before, and said cheerfully, "Right, all of you, lesson time. Come on through and see how you stand up to some grilling." Cat hastily swallowed his cocoa-flavoured marmalade. Beyond the door was a schoolroom. It was a real, genuine schoolroom, although there were only 4 desks in it. There was a blackboard, a globe, the pitted school floor, and the schoolroom smell. There was that kind of glass-fronted bookcase without which no schoolroom is complete, and the battered grey-green and dark blue books without which no schoolroom bookcase is complete. On the walls were big pictures of the statues Mr. Saunders had found so interesting. 2 of the desks were brown and old. 2 were new and yellow with varnish. Gwendolyn and Cat sat silently in the new desks. Julia hurried in with her face shining from soap and sat in the old desk beside Roger's, and the grilling began. Mr. Saunders strode gawkily up and down in front of the blackboard, asking keen questions. His tweed jacket billowed out from his back, just as his coat had done in the wind. Perhaps that was why the sleeves of the jacket were so much too short for Mr. Saunders' long arms. The long arm shot out, and a foot of bony wrist with a keen finger on the end of it pointed at Cat. What part did witchcraft play in the Wars of the Roses?" Said Cat. I'm afraid I haven't done them yet, sir." "Gwendolyn," said Mr. Saunders. "Oh, a very big part," Gwendolyn guessed airily. "Wrong," said Mr. Saunders. "Roger." From the grilling, it emerged that Roger and Julia had forgotten a great deal over the summer, but even so, they were well ahead of Cat in most things, and far ahead of Gwendolyn in everything. "What did you learn at school?" Mr. Saunders asked her, in some exasperation. Gwendolyn shrugged. "I've forgotten. It wasn't interesting. I was concentrating on witchcraft, and I intend to go on doing that, please." "I'm afraid you can't," said Mr. Saunders. Gwendolyn stared at him, hardly able to believe she had heard him right. "What?" she almost shrieked. But I'm terribly talented. I have to go on with it." "Your talents will keep," said Mr. Saunders. "You can take up witchcraft again when you've learned something else. Open your arithmetic book and do me the first 4 exercises. Eric, I think I'll set you going on some history. Write me an essay on the reign of King Canute." He moved on to set work for Roger and Julia. Cat and Gwendolyn opened books. Gwendolyn's face was red, then white. As Mr. Saunders bent over Roger, her inkwell sailed up out of the socket in her desk and emptied itself over the back of Mr. Saunders' billowing tweed jacket. Cat bit his lip in order not to laugh. Julia watched with calm interest. Mr. Saunders did not seem to notice. The inkwell returned quietly to its socket. "Gwendolyn," said Mr. Saunders without turning around, "get the ink jar and funnel out of the bottom of the cupboard and refill that inkwell. And fill it properly, please." Gwendolyn got up, jauntily and defiantly, found the big flask and funnel, and started to fill her inkwell. 10 minutes later, she was still pouring away. Her face was puzzled at first, then red, then white with fury again. She tried to put the flask down, and found she could not. She tried whispering a spell. Mr. Saunders turned and looked at her. "You're being perfectly horrible," said Gwendolyn. "Besides, I'm allowed to do witchcraft when you're here." "No one is allowed to pour ink over their tutor," Mr. Saunders said cheerfully. "And I'd already told you that you've given up witchcraft for the time being. Keep on pouring till I tell you to stop." Gwendolyn poured ink for the next half hour, and got angrier every minute of it. Cat was impressed. He suspected that Mr. Saunders was rather a powerful magician. Certainly, when he next looked at Mr. Saunders, there was no sign of any ink on his back. Cat looked at Mr. Saunders fairly often, to see whether it was safe to change his pen from his right to his left hand. He had been punished so often for writing left-handed that he was good at keeping an eye on his teachers. When Mr. Saunders turned his way, Cat used his right hand. It was slow and reluctant, but as soon as Mr. Saunders turned away again, Cat changed his pen over and got on like a house on fire. The main trouble was that in order not to smudge the ink with his left hand, he had to hold the paper sideways. But he was pretty deft at flicking his book straight again whenever Mr. Saunders seemed likely to look at him. When the half hour was over, Mr. Saunders, without turning around, told Gwendolyn to stop pouring ink and do sums. Then, still without turning around, he said to Cat, "Eric, what are you doing?" "An essay on King Canute," Cat said innocently. Then Mr. Saunders did turn around, but by that time the paper was straight and the pen in Cat's right hand. "Which hand were you writing with?" he said. Cat was used to this. He held up his right hand with the pen in it. "It looked like both hands to me," Mr. Saunders said, and he came over and looked at the page Cat had written. "It was both." "It doesn't show," Cat said miserably. "Not much," Mr. Saunders agreed. "Does it amuse you to write with alternate hands or something?" "No," Cat confessed, "but I'm left-handed." Then, as Cat had feared, Mr. Saunders flew into a towering rage. His face went red. He slammed his big knobby hand down on Cat's desk so that Cat jumped, and the inkwell jumped too, sending ink splashing over Mr. Saunders' great hand and over Cat's essay. "Left-handed!" he roared. "Then why the black gentleman don't you write with your left hand, boy?" They punish me if I do," Cat faltered, very shaken, and very perplexed to find Mr. Saunders was angry for such a peculiar reason. "Then they deserve to be tied up in knots and roasted," roared Mr. Saunders, "whoever they are. You're doing yourself untold harm by obeying them, boy. If I catch you writing with your right hand again, you'll be in really serious trouble." "Yes," Cat said, relieved, but still very shaken. He looked mournfully at his ink-splashed essay and hoped Mr. Saunders might use a little witchcraft on that too. But Mr. Saunders took the book and tore the page right out. "Now do it again properly," he said, slapping the book back in front of Cat. Cat was still writing all over again about Canute when Mary came in with a tray of milk and biscuits and a cup of coffee for Mr. Saunders. And after the milk and biscuits, Mr. Saunders told Cat and Gwendolyn they were free till lunch. "Though not because of a good morning's work," he said. "Go out and get some fresh air." As they went out of the schoolroom, he turned to Roger and Julia. "Now we'll have a little witchcraft," he said. "And let's hope you haven't forgotten all that, too." Gwendolyn stopped in the doorway and looked at him. "No, not you," Mr. Saunders said to her. "I told you." Gwendolyn whirled around and ran away, through the shabby playroom and down the corridor beyond. Cat ran after her as hard as he could, but he did not catch up with her until they came to a much grander part of the castle, where a big marble staircase curled away downward, and the light came from an elegant dome in the roof. "This isn't the right way," Cat panted. "Yes, it is," Gwendolyn said fiercely. "I'm going to find Chrestomanci. Why should those two fat little fools learn witchcraft and not me? I've got twice their gifts. It took two of them just to levitate a jug of cocoa. So I want Chrestomanci." By a stroke of good fortune, Chrestomanci was coming along the gallery on the other side of the staircase, behind a curly marble balustrade. He was wearing a fawn-coloured suit now instead of the imperial dressing gown, but he looked, if possible, even more elegant. By the look on his face, his thoughts were miles away. Gwendolyn ran around the head of the marble staircase and stood herself in front of him. Chrestomanci blinked and looked vaguely from her to Cat. "Was one of you wanting me?" "Yes, me," said Gwendolyn. "Mr. Saunders won't give me witchcraft lessons, and I want you to tell him he must." "Oh, but I can't do that," Chrestomanci said absent-mindedly. "Sorry," and so on. Gwendolyn stamped her foot. It made no noise to speak of, even there on the marble floor, and there was no echo. Gwendolyn was forced to shout instead. "Why not? You must! You must! You must!" Chrestomanci looked down at her in a peering, surprised way, as if he had only just seen her. "You seem to be annoyed," he said. "But I'm afraid it's unavoidable. I told Michael Saunders that he was on no account to teach either of you witchcraft." You did? Why not?" Gwendolyn shouted. "Because you were bound to misuse it, of course," said Chrestomanci, as if it were quite obvious. "But I'll reconsider it in a year or so, if you still want to learn." Then he smiled kindly at Gwendolyn, obviously expecting her to be pleased, and drifted dreamily away down the marble stairs. Gwendolyn kicked the marble balustrade and hurt her foot. That sent her into a rage as strong as Mr. Saunders. She danced and jumped and shrieked at the head of the stairs until Cat was quite frightened of her. She shook her fist after Chrestomanci. "I'll show you! You wait!" she screamed. But Chrestomanci had gone out of sight around the bend in the staircase, and perhaps he could not hear. Even Gwendolyn's loudest scream sounded thin and small. Cat was puzzled. What was it about this castle? He looked up at the dome where the light came in and thought that Gwendolyn's screaming ought to have echoed around it like the dickens. Instead, it made a small, high squawking. While he waited for her to get her temper back, Cat experimentally put his fingers to his mouth and whistled as hard as he could. It made a queer, blunt noise, like a squeaky boot. It also brought the old lady with the mittens out of a door in the gallery. "You noisy little children," she said. "If you want to scream and whistle, you must go out in the grounds and do it there." "Oh, come on," Gwendolyn said crossly to Cat, and the two of them ran away to the part of the castle they were used to. After a bit of muddling around, they discovered the door they had first come in by, and let themselves outside through it. "Let's explore everywhere," said Cat. Gwendolyn shrugged and said it suited her. So they set off. Beyond the shrubbery of rhododendrons, they found themselves out on the great smooth lawn with the cedar trees. It spread across the entire front of the newer part of the castle. On the other side of it, Cat saw the most interesting, high, sun-soaked old wall, with trees hanging over it. It was clearly the ruins of an even older castle. Cat set off toward it at a trot, past the big windows of the newer castle, dragging Gwendolyn with him. But halfway there, Gwendolyn stopped and stood poking at the shaved green grass with her toe. She said. "Do you think this counts as in the castle?" "I expect so," said Cat. "Do come on. I want to explore those ruins there." However, the first wall they came to was a low one, and the door in it led them into a very formal garden. It had broad gravel paths running very straight between box hedges. There were yew trees everywhere, clipped into severe pyramids, and all the flowers were yellow, in tidy clumps. "Boring," said Cat, and led the way to the ruined wall beyond. But once again there was a lower wall in the way, and this time they came out into an orchard. It was a very tidy orchard, in which all the trees were trained flat, to stand like hedges on either side of the winding gravel paths. They were loaded with apples, some of them quite big. After what Chrestomanci had said about scrumping, Cat did not quite dare pick one, but Gwendolyn picked a big red Worcester and bit into it. Instantly, a gardener appeared from around a corner and told them reproachfully that picking apples was forbidden. Gwendolyn threw the apple down in the path. "Take it, then. There was a maggot in it anyway." They went on, leaving the gardener staring ruefully at the bitten apple. And instead of reaching the ruins, they came to a goldfish pond, and after that to a rose garden. Here Gwendolyn, as an experiment, tried picking a rose. Instantly another gardener appeared and explained respectfully that they were not allowed to pick roses. so Gwendolyn threw the rose down too. Then Cat looked over his shoulder and discovered that the ruins were somehow behind them now. He turned back, but he still did not seem to reach them. It was nearly lunchtime before he suddenly turned into a steep little path between two walls and found the ruins above him at the top of the path. Cat pelted joyfully up the steep path. The sun-soaked wall ahead was taller than most houses, and there were trees at the top of it. When he was close enough, Cat saw that there was a giddy stone staircase jutting out of the wall, more like a stone ladder than a stair. It was so old that snapdragons and wallflowers had rooted in it, and hollyhocks had grown up against the place where the stair met the ground. Cat had to push aside a tall red hollyhock in order to put his foot on the first stair. No sooner had he done so than yet another gardener came puffing up the steep path. "You can't go there. That's Chrestomanci's garden up there, that is." "Why can't we?" said Cat, deeply disappointed. "Because it's not allowed, that's why." Slowly and reluctantly Cat came away. The gardener stood at the foot of the stair to make sure he went. "Bother," Cat said. "I'm getting rather sick of Chrestomanci forbidding things," said Gwendolyn. "It's time someone taught him a lesson." "What are you going to do?" said Cat. "Wait and see," said Gwendolyn, pressing her lips together in her stormiest way. Chapter 5. Gwendolyn refused to tell Cat what she was going to do. This meant that Cat had rather a melancholy time. After a wholesome lunch of turnips and boiled mutton, they had lessons again. After that, Gwendolyn ran hastily away and would not let Cat come with her. Cat did not know what to do. "Would you care to come out and play?" Roger asked. Cat looked at him and saw that he was just being polite. "No, thank you," he said politely. He was forced to wander around the gardens on his own. There was a wood lower down, full of horse chestnuts, but they were not nearly ripe. As Cat was half-heartedly staring up into one, he saw there was a tree house in it about halfway up. This was more like it. Cat was just about to climb up to it when he heard voices and saw Julia's skirt flutter among the leaves. So that was no good. It was Julia and Roger's private treehouse, and they were in it. Cat wandered away again. He came to the lawn, and there was Gwendolyn, crouching under one of the cedars, very busy digging a small hole. "What are you doing?" said Cat. "Go away," said Gwendolyn. Cat went away. He was sure what Gwendolyn was doing was witchcraft and had to do with teaching Chrestomanci a lesson. But it was no good asking Gwendolyn when she was being this secretive. Cat had to wait. He waited through another terrifying dinner, and then through a long, long evening. Gwendolyn locked herself in her room after dinner and told him to go away when he knocked. Next morning, Cat woke up early and hurried to the nearest of his 3 windows. He saw at once what Gwendolyn had been doing. The lawn was ruined. It was not a smooth stretch of green velvet any longer. It was a mass of molehills. As far as Cat could see in both directions, there were little green mounds, little heaps of raw earth, long lines of raw earth, and long green furrows of raised grass. There must have been an army of moles at work on it all night. About a dozen gardeners were standing in a gloomy huddle, scratching their heads over it. Cat threw on his clothes and dashed downstairs. Gwendolyn was leaning out of her window in her frilly cotton nightdress, glowing with pride. "Look at that," she said to Cat. "Isn't it marvellous? There's acres of it too. It took me hours yesterday evening to make sure it was all spoiled. That will make Chrestomanci think a bit." Cat was sure it would. He did not know how much a huge stretch of turf like that would cost to replace, but he suspected it was a great deal. He was afraid Gwendolyn would be in really bad trouble. But to his astonishment, nobody so much as mentioned the lawn. Euphemia came in a minute later, but all she said was, "You'll both be late for your breakfast again." Roger and Julia said nothing at all. They silently accepted the marmalade and Cat's knife when he passed them over, but the sole thing either of them said was when Julia dropped Cat's knife and picked it up again, all fluffy. She said, "Bother." And when Mr. Saunders called them through for lessons, the only things he talked about were what he was teaching them. Cat decided that nobody knew Gwendolyn had caused the moles. They could have no idea what a strong witch she was. There were no lessons after lunch that day. Mr. Saunders explained that they always had Wednesday afternoons off. And at lunchtime, every molehill had gone. When they looked out of the playroom window, the lawn was like a sheet of velvet again. "I don't believe it," Gwendolyn whispered to Cat. "It must be an illusion. They're trying to make me feel small." They went out and looked after lunch. They had to be fairly cautious about it, because Mr. Saunders was taking his afternoon off in a deck chair under one of the cedars, reading a yellow paperback book which seemed to amuse him a great deal. Gwendolyn sauntered out into the middle of the lawn and pretended to be admiring the castle. She pretended to tie her bootlace and prodded the turf with her fingers. "I don't understand it," she said. Being a witch, she knew the close, smooth turf was no illusion. "It really is all right. How was it done?" "They must have carted in new turf while we were having lessons," Cat suggested. "Don't be stupid," said Gwendolyn. "New turf would all be in squares still, and this isn't." Mr. Saunders called to them. Gwendolyn looked for a second more apprehensive than Cat had ever seen her, but she hid it fairly well, and led the way casually over to the deck chair. Cat saw that the yellow book was in French. Fancy being able to laugh at something in French! Mr. Saunders must be a learned magician as well as a strong one. Mr. Saunders laid the book face down on the once more beautiful grass, and smiled up at them. "You two went away so quickly that you never gave me time to dish you out your pocket money. Here you are." He handed them each a large silver coin. Cat stared at his. It was a crown piece. 5 whole shillings. He had never had so much money to spend in his life. Mr. Saunders added to his amazement by saying, "You'll get that every Wednesday. I don't know whether you're savers or spenders. What Julia and Roger usually do is to go down to the village and blow it all on sweets." "Thank you," said Cat, "very much. Shall we go down to the village, Gwendolyn?" "We may as well," Gwendolyn agreed. She was divided between a defiant desire to stay at the castle and face whatever trouble was coming over the moles, and relief at an excuse to get away. "I expect Chrestomanci will send for me as soon as he realizes it was me," she said, as they walked down the avenue of trees. "Do you think it was Mr. Saunders who put the lawn right?" Cat asked. Gwendolyn frowned. "He couldn't have. He was teaching us." "Those gardeners," suggested Cat. "Some of them could be warlocks. They did turn up awfully quickly to forbid us things." Gwendolyn laughed scornfully. "Think of the willing warlock." Cat did, a little dubiously. The willing warlock was not much more gifted than Mrs. Sharp. He was usually hired for heavy carrying jobs, or to make the wrong horse win at the races. All the same, he argued, they could be specialists, garden warlocks. Gwendolyn only laughed again. The village was just beyond the castle gates, at the foot of the hill where the castle stood. It was a pretty place, around a big green. Across the green there were shops, a beautiful bow-fronted baker's and an equally beautiful sweet shop and post office. Cat wanted to visit both, but Gwendolyn stopped at a third shop, which was a junk shop. Cat did not mind going into that either. It looked interesting. But Gwendolyn shook her head irritably and stopped a village boy who was loitering near it. "I was told a Mr. Baslam lives in this village. Can you tell me where he lives?" The boy made a face. "Him? He's no good. Down there at the end of that alley if you really want to know." And he stood looking at them, with the air of someone who has earned sixpence for his pains. Neither Cat nor Gwendolyn had any money beside their crown pieces. They had to go away without giving him anything. The boy shouted after them, "Stuck-up little witch! Mingy little warlock!" Gwendolyn did not mind this in the least, but Cat was so ashamed that he wanted to go back and explain. Mr. Baslam lived in a shabby cottage with an ill-written notice propped in one window. "Exotic surplice." Gwendolyn looked at it rather pityingly as she hammered on the door with the dingy knocker. When Mr. Baslam opened his door, he proved to be a fat person in old trousers, which sagged to make room for his fatness, and with red, drooping eyes like a St. Bernard's. He started to shut the door again as soon as he saw them. "Not today, thank you," he said, and a strong smell of beer came out with the words. "Mr. Nostrum sent me," said Gwendolyn. "Mr. William Nostrum." The door stopped shutting. "Ah," said Mr. Baslam, "then you'd better both come in. This way." He led them into a poky room, containing 4 chairs, a table, and several dozen cases of stuffed animals. There was hardly room for all the cases of stuffed animals. They stood higgledy-piggledy, one on top of another, and they were all very dusty. "Sit down, then," said Mr. Baslam rather grudgingly. Cat sat down gently and tried not to breathe too deeply. Beside the beery smell from Mr. Baslam, there was a faint rotting smell, and a smell like pickles. Cat thought that some of the stuffed animals had not been properly cured. The smell did not seem to bother Gwendolyn. She sat looking like a picture of a perfect little girl. Her cream-coloured dress spread crisply around her, and her broad hat becomingly shaded her golden hair. She looked at Mr. Baslam with severe blue eyes. "I think your notice is spelled wrong." Mr. Baslam drooped his St. Bernard eyes and made gestures that were meant to be joking. I know, but I don't want to be taken serious, do I? Not on the very threshold, as it were? Now, what was you wanting? Mr. William Nostrum don't tell me too much of his plans. I'm only a humble supplier." "I want some supplies, of course," said Gwendolyn. Cat listened rather bored to Gwendolyn bargaining for the materials of witchcraft. Mr. Baslam fumbled in the backs of stuffed animal cases and fetched out newspaper screws of this and that, newt's eyes, snake's tongues, cardamom, hellebore, mummy, nitre, seed of moly, and various resins, which probably accounted for the unpleasant smell. He wanted more for them than Gwendolyn would pay. She was determined to lay out her 5 shillings to the best possible advantage. Mr. Baslam seemed to resent it. "Know your own mind, don't you?" he said peevishly. "I know how much things should cost," said Gwendolyn. She took her hat off, packed the little screws of newspaper carefully into its crown, and put it neatly back on her head again. "And last, I think I shall be wanting some dragon's blood," she said. "Oh," said Mr. Baslam, dolefully shaking his head so that his hanging cheeks flapped. "Dragon's blood is banned from use, young lady. You ought to know that. I don't know as I can manage you any of that." "Mr. Nostrum, both Mr. Nostrums told me you could get anything," said Gwendolyn. "They said you were the best agent they knew. And I'm not asking for dragon's blood now. I'm ordering some." Mr. Baslam looked gratified at being praised by the Nostrum brothers, but he was still dubious. "It's a fearful strong charm needs dragon's blood," he said plaintively. "You won't be doing anything that strong yourself, a young lady like you, now?" "I don't know yet," said Gwendolyn, "but I think I might. I'm on advanced magic, you know, and I want dragon's blood in case I need it." "It'll come, dear," Mr. Baslam warned her. "It's costly stuff. There's the risk to pay for, you see. I don't want the law on me." "I can pay," said Gwendolyn. "I'll pay in instalments. You can take the rest of the 5 shillings on account." Mr. Baslam was unable to resist this. The way he looked at the crown piece Gwendolyn handed to him made Cat see vividly a long row of frothing pints of beer. "Done," said Mr. Baslam. Gwendolyn smiled graciously and got up to go. Cat thankfully leaped up too. "What about you, young gentleman?" Mr. Baslam asked wheedlingly. "Aren't you going to try your hand at a bit of necromancy at all?" "He's just my brother," said Gwendolyn.
Yes," said Mr. Baslam. "He's that one, of course. Well, good day to you both. Come again any time."
"When will you have the dragon's blood?" Gwendolyn asked him on the doorstep. Mr. Baslam thought.
"Say a week."
Gwendolyn's face glowed. "How quick! I knew you were a good agent. Where do you get it from so quickly?"
"Now that would be telling, wouldn't it?" said Mr. Baslam. "It has to come from another world, but which one is a trade secret, young lady."
Gwendolyn was jubilant as they went back along the alley. "A week!" she said. "That's the quickest I've ever heard. It has to be smuggled in from this other world, you know. He must have awfully good connections there." "Or he's got some already, inside a stuffed bird," said Cat, who would not like Mr. Baslam at all. "Whatever do you want dragon's blood for? Mrs. Sharp says it costs £50 an ounce." "Be quiet," said Gwendolyn. "Oh, quick! Hurry, Cat! Get into that sweet shop. She mustn't know where I've been." Out on the village green, a lady carrying a parasol was talking to a clergyman. She was Chrestomanci's wife. Cat and Gwendolyn bundled themselves into the shop and hoped she had not seen them. There, Cat bought them a bag of toffee each. Milly was still there, so he bought some licorice too. Milly was still talking to the clergyman even then, so he bought Gwendolyn a pen wiper and himself a postcard of the castle. Milly was still there. But Cat could not think of anything else to buy, so they had to come out of the shop. Milly beckoned to them as soon as they did. "Come and meet the dear vicar." The vicar, who was old with a weak and wandering look, shakily shook hands with them and said he would see them on Sunday. Then he said he really must be going now. "And so must we," said Milly. "Come on, my dears, we'll walk back to the castle together." There was nothing to do but walk beside her under the shadow of her parasol, across the green and between the lodge gates. Cat was afraid she was going to ask them why they had been visiting Mr. Baslam. Gwendolyn was sure she was going to ask her about the moles in the lawn. But what Milly said was, "I'm glad of a chance to talk to you, my loves. I haven't had a moment to see how you were getting on. Are you all right? Are you finding it very strange?" A little," Cat admitted. "The first few days are always the worst anywhere," said Milly. "I'm sure you'll soon find your way around. And don't hesitate to use the toys in the playroom if you want. They're for everyone. Private toys are in one's own room. How are you liking your rooms?" Cat looked up at her in astonishment. She was talking as if moles and witchcraft had never existed. Milly beamed back at him. Despite her elegant ruched dress and her lacy parasol, she was a most ordinary, kind, good-natured lady. Cat liked her. He assured Milly that he liked his room and his bathroom, particularly the shower, and explained that he had never had a bathroom to himself before. "Oh, I'm glad. I did so hope you'd like it," said Milly. "Miss Bessemer wanted to put you next to Roger, but I thought that room was so dull, and it doesn't have a shower. Look at it sometime and you'll see what I mean." She walked on up the avenue, chattering away, and Cat found himself doing all the rest of the talking. As soon as it was clear that Milly was not going to mention either lawns or exotic supplies, Gwendolyn began to despise her. She kept up a scornful silence and left Cat to talk. After a while, Milly asked Cat what thing about the castle he was finding strangest. Cat answered shyly, but without hesitation, "The way everyone talks at supper." Milly let out such a yell of despair that Cat jumped, and Gwendolyn was more scornful than ever. "Oh dear, poor Eric. I've seen you looking. Isn't it awful? Michael gets these enthusiasms, and then he can talk of nothing else. It should be wearing off in a day or so, though, and then we can have reasonable talk again, and make a few jokes. I like to laugh at dinner, don't you? I'm afraid nothing will stop poor Bernard talking about stocks and shares, but you mustn't take any notice of that. Nobody listens to Bernard. Do you like eclairs, by the way?" "Yes," said Cat. "Oh, good," said Milly. "I've ordered tea for us on the lawn, since this is your first Wednesday, and I didn't want to waste this lovely weather. Isn't it funny how September's nearly always fine? If we slip through the trees here, we should be on the lawn as soon as tea is." Sure enough, they followed Milly out of the shrubbery to find a whole cluster of deck chairs around the one where Mr. Saunders was, and footmen putting out tables and carrying trays. Most of the family were gathering among the deck chairs. Gwendolyn followed Milly and Cat over, looking nervous and defiant. She knew Chrestomanci was going to speak to her about the lawn now, and to make matters worse, she was not going to have a chance to take the exotic supplies out of her hat before he did. But Chrestomanci was not there, though everyone else was. Milly pushed between Stocks and Shares Bernard and Julia, and past the old lady with mittens to point her parasol sternly at Mr. Saunders. "Michael, you are absolutely forbidden to talk about art during tea," she said, and spoiled the sternness rather by laughing. The family evidently felt much the same as Cat. Several of them said, "Hear, hear," and Roger said, "Can we start, Mummy?" Cat enjoyed the tea. It was the first time he had enjoyed anything since he came to the castle. There were paper-thin cucumber sandwiches and big, squashy eclairs. Cat ate even more than Roger did. He was surrounded by cheerful, ordinary chat from the family, with a hum of Stocks and Shares in the background, and the sun lay warm and peaceful on the green stretches of the lawn. Cat was glad someone had somehow restored it. He liked it better smooth. He began to think he could almost be happy at the castle with a little practice. Gwendolyn was nothing like so happy. The newspaper packets weighed on her head. Their smell spoiled the taste of the eclairs, and she knew she would have to wait until dinner before Chrestomanci spoke to her about the lawn. Dinner was later that night because of the tea. Dusk was falling when they filed into the dining room. There were lighted candles all down the polished table. Cat could see them, and the rest of the room reflected in the row of long windows facing him. It was a pleasing sight, and a useful one. Cat could see the footman coming. For once he was not taken by surprise when the man thrust a tray of little fish and pickled cabbage over his shoulder. And, as he was now forbidden to use his right hand, Cat felt quite justified in changing the serving things over. He began to feel he was settling in. Because he had not been allowed to talk about art at tea, Mr. Saunders was more than usually eloquent at dinner. He talked and he talked. He took Chrestomanci's attention to himself, and he talked at him. Chrestomanci seemed dreamy and good-humoured. He listened and nodded. And Gwendolyn grew crosser every minute. Chrestomanci said not a word about lawns, neither here nor in the drawing-room beforehand. It became clearer and clearer that no one was going to mention the matter at all. Gwendolyn was furious. She wanted her powers recognised. She wanted to show Chrestomanci she was a witch to be reckoned with. So there was nothing for it but to begin on another spell. She was a little hampered by not having any ingredients to hand, but there was one thing she could do quite easily. The dinner went on. Mr. Saunders talked on. Footmen came around with the next course. Cat looked over at the windows to see when the silver plate would come to him, and he nearly screamed. There was a skinny white creature there. It was pressed against the dark outside of the glass, mouthing and waving. It looked like the lost ghost of a lunatic. It was weak and white and loathsome. It was draggled and slimy. Even though Cat realised almost at once that it was Gwendolyn's doing, he still stared at it in horror. Milly saw him staring. She looked herself, shuddered, and tapped Chrestomanci gently on the back of the hand with her spoon. Chrestomanci came out of his gentle dream and glanced at the window too. He gave the piteous creature a bored look and sighed. "And so I still think Florence is the finest of all the Italian states," said Mr. Saunders. "People usually put in a word for Venice," said Chrestomanci. "Fraser, would you draw the curtains, please? Thank you." "No, no. In my opinion, Venice is overrated," Mr. Saunders asserted, and he went on to explain why, while the butler drew the long orange curtains and shut the creature out of sight. "Yes, maybe you're right. Florence has more to offer," Chrestomanci agreed. "By the way, Gwendolyn, when I said the castle, I meant, of course, the castle grounds as well as indoors. Now, do carry on, Michael. Venice." Everyone carried on, except Cat. He could imagine the creature still mouthing and fumbling at the glass behind the orange curtains. He could not eat for thinking of it. "It's all right, stupid. I've sent it away," said Gwendolyn. Her voice was sticky with rage. Chapter 6. Gwendolyn gave vent to her fury in her room after dinner. She jumped on her bed and threw cushions about, screaming. Cat stood prudently back against the wall, waiting for her to finish. But Gwendolyn did not finish until she had pledged herself to a campaign against Chrestomanci. "I hate this place," she bawled. "They try to cover everything up in soft, sweet niceness. I hate it! I hate it!" Her voice was muffled among the velvets of her room, and swallowed up in the prevailing softness of the castle. "Do you hear it?" Gwendolyn screamed. "It's an eiderdown of hideous niceness. I wreck their lawn, so they give me tea. I conjure up a lovely apparition, and they have the curtains drawn. Fraser, would you draw the curtains, please? Ugh! Chrestomanci makes me sick!" "I didn't think it was a lovely apparition," Cat said, shivering. "Ha ha! You didn't know I could do that, did you?" said Gwendolyn. "It wasn't to frighten you, you idiot. It was to give Chrestomanci a shock. I hate him. He wasn't even interested." "What did he have us to live here for, if he isn't interested in you either?" Cat wondered. Gwendolyn was rather struck by this. "I hadn't thought of that," she said. "It may be serious. Go away. I want to think about it." "Anyway," she shouted as Cat was going to the door, "he's going to be interested if it's the last thing I do. I'm going to do something every day until he notices." Once again, Cat was mournfully on his own. Remembering what Milly had said, he went along to the playroom. But Roger and Julia were there, playing with soldiers on the stained carpet. The little tin grenadiers were marching about. Some were wheeling up cannon, others were lying behind cushions, firing their rifles with little pinpricks of bangs. Roger and Julia turned around guiltily. "You won't mention this, will you?" said Julia. "Would you like to come and play too?" Roger asked politely. "Oh, no thanks," Cat said hastily. He knew he could never join in this kind of game unless Gwendolyn helped him. But he did not dare disturb Gwendolyn in her present mood. And he had nothing to do. Then he remembered that Milly had obviously expected him to poke about the castle more than he had done. So he set off to explore, feeling rather daring. The castle seemed strange at night. There were dim little electric lights at regular intervals. The green carpet glowed gently, and things were reflected in the polished floor and walls even more strongly than they were by day. Cat walked softly along, accompanied by several reflected ghosts of himself, until he hardly felt real. All the doors he saw were closed. Cat listened at one or two and heard nothing. He had not quite the courage to open any of them. He went on and on. After a while, he found he had somehow worked around to the older part of the castle. Here the walls were whitewashed stone, and all the windows went in nearly 3 feet before there was any glass. Then Cat came to a staircase, which was the twin of the one that twisted up to his room, except that it twisted in the opposite direction. Cat went cautiously up it. He was just on the last bend when a door at the top opened. A brighter square of light shone on the wall at the head of the stairs, and a shadow stood in it that could only belong to Chrestomanci. No one else's shadow could be so tall, with such a smooth head, and such a lot of ruffles on its shirt front. Cat stopped. "And let's hope the wretched girl won't try that again," Chrestomanci said, out of sight above. He sounded a good deal more alert than usual, and rather angry. Mr. Saunders' voice, from farther away, said, "I've had about enough of her already, frankly. I suppose she'll come to her senses soon. What possessed her to give away the source of her power like that?
"Ignorance," said Chrestomanci. "If I thought she had the least idea what she was doing, it would be the last thing she ever did in that line, or any other."
"My back was to it," said Mr. Saunders. "Which was it, number 5?
"No, number 3, by the look of its hair. A revenant," said Chrestomanci, "for which we must be thankful."
He began to come down the stairs. Cat was too scared to move.
"I'll have to get the examining board to revise their elementary magic courses," Chrestomanci called back as he came downstairs, "to include more theory. These hedge wizards push their good pupils straight on to advanced work without any proper grounding at all."
Saying this, Chrestomanci came down around the corner and saw Cat.
"Oh, hello," he said. "I'd no idea you were here. Like to come up and have a look at Michael's workshop?"
Cat nodded. He did not dare do otherwise. Chrestomanci seemed quite friendly, however, and so did Mr. Saunders when Chrestomanci ushered Cat into the room at the top of the stairs. "Hello, Eric," he said in his cheerful way. "Have a look around. Does any of this mean anything to you?" Cat shook his head. The room was round, like his own, but larger, and it was a regular magician's workshop. That much he could see. He recognized the 5-pointed star painted on the floor. The smell coming from the burning cresset hanging from the ceiling was the same smell that had hung about Coven Street back in Wolvercote. But he had no idea of the use of the things set out on the various trestle tables. One table was crowded with torts and limbecs, some bubbling, some empty. A second was piled with books and scrolls. The third bench had signs chalked all over it, and a mummified creature of some sort lying among the signs. Cat's eyes travelled over all this, and over more books crammed into shelves around the walls, and more shelves filled with jars of ingredients. Big jars, like the ones in sweet shops. He realized Mr. Saunders worked in a big way. His scudding eyes raced over some of the labels on the huge jars. Newt's eyes, gum arabic, elixir St. John's wort, dragon's blood dried. The last jar was almost full of dark brown powder. Cat's eyes went back to the mummified animal stretched among the signs chalked on the third table. Its feet had claws like a dog's. It looked like a large lizard, but there seemed to be wings on its back. Cat was almost sure it had once been a small dragon. "Means nothing, eh?" said Mr. Saunders. Cat turned around and found that Chrestomanci had gone. That made him a little easier. "This must have cost a lot," he said. "The taxpayer pays, fortunately," said Mr. Saunders. "Would you like to learn what all this is about?" "You mean learn witchcraft?" Cat asked. "No. No, thanks. I wouldn't be any good at it."
"Well, I had at least 2 other things in mind besides witchcraft," Mr. Saunders said. "But what makes you think you'd be no good?"
"Because I can't do it," Cat explained. "Spells just don't work for me."
"Are you sure you went about them in the right way?" Mr. Saunders asked. He wandered up to the mummified dragon, or whatever, and gave it an absent-minded flick. To Cat's disgust, the thing twitched all over. Filmy wings jerked and spread on its back. Then it went lifeless again. The sight sent Cat backing towards the door. He was almost as alarmed as he was the time Miss Larkin suddenly spoke with a man's voice. And come to think of it, the voice had been not so unlike Mr. Saunders.
"I went about it every way I could think," Cat said, backing, "and I couldn't even turn buttons into gold, and that was simple."
Mr. Saunders laughed. "Perhaps you weren't greedy enough. All right, cut along if you want to go."
Cat fled in great relief. As he ran through the strange corridors, he thought he ought to let Gwendolyn know that Chrestomanci had, after all, been interested in her apparition, and even angry. But Gwendolyn had locked her door, and would not answer when he called to her.
This ends Disc 2. Charmed Life, Disc 3.
He tried again next morning. But before he had a chance to speak to Gwendolyn, Euphemia came in carrying a letter. As Gwendolyn snatched it eagerly from Euphemia, Cat recognised Mr. Nostrum's jagged writing on the envelope. The next moment, Gwendolyn was raging again. "Who did this? When did this come?" The envelope had been neatly cut open along the top. "This morning, by the postmark," said Euphemia. "And don't look at me like that. Miss Bessemer gave it to me open." "How dare she?" said Gwendolyn. "How dare she read my letters? I'm going straight to Chrestomanci about this." "You'll regret it if you do," said Euphemia, as Gwendolyn pushed past her to the door. Gwendolyn whirled around on her. "Oh, shut up, you stupid, frog-faced girl!" Cat thought that was a little unfair. Euphemia, though she did have rather goggling eyes, was actually quite pretty. "Come on, Cat!" Gwendolyn shouted at him, and she ran away along the corridor with her letter. Cat panted behind her, and once again did not catch up with her until they were beside the marble staircase. "Chrestomanci!" bawled Gwendolyn, thin and small and unechoing. Chrestomanci was coming up the marble staircase in a wide, flowing dressing gown that was partly orange and partly bright pink. He looked like the Emperor of Peru. By the suave, vague look on his face, he had not noticed Gwendolyn and Cat. Gwendolyn shouted down at him, "Here, you! Come here at once!" Chrestomanci's face turned upwards, and his eyebrows went up. "Someone's been opening my letters," said Gwendolyn, "and I don't care who it is, but I'm not having it. Do you hear?" Cat gasped at the way she spoke. Chrestomanci seemed perplexed. "How are you not having it?" he said. "I won't put up with it," Gwendolyn shouted at him. "In future my letters are going to come to me closed." "You mean you want me to steam them open and stick them down afterward?" Chrestomanci asked doubtfully. "It's more trouble, but I'll do that if it makes you happier." Gwendolyn stared at him. "You mean you did it? You read a letter addressed to me?" Chrestomanci nodded blandly. "Naturally. If someone like Henry Nostrum writes letters to you, I have to make sure he's not writing anything unsuitable. He's a very seedy person." "He was my teacher," Gwendolyn said furiously. "You've no right to." "It's a pity," said Chrestomanci, "that you were taught by a hedge wizard. You'll have to unlearn such a lot. And it's a pity, too, that I've no right to open your letters. I hope you don't get many, or my conscience will give me no peace." "You intend to go on?" Gwendolyn said. "Then watch out. I warn you." "That is very considerate of you," said Chrestomanci. "I like to be warned." He came up the rest of the marble stairs and went past Gwendolyn and Cat. The pink and orange dressing gown swirled, revealing a bright scarlet lining. Cat blinked. Gwendolyn stared vengefully as the dazzling dressing gown flowed away along the gallery. "Oh, no, don't notice me, will you?" she said. "Make jokes. You wait. Cat, I'm so furious." "You were awfully rude," said Cat. "He deserved it," said Gwendolyn, and began to hurry back toward the playroom. "Opening poor Mr. Nostrum's letter. It isn't that I mind him reading it. We arranged a code, so horrid Chrestomanci will never know what it's really saying. but there is the signature. But it's the insult, the indignity. I'm at their mercy in this castle. I'm all on my own, in distress, and I can't even stop them reading my letters. But I'll show them. You wait." Cat knew better than to say anything. Gwendolyn slammed into the playroom, flounced down at the table, and began at last to read her letter. "I told you so," said Euphemia, while Mary was working the lift. Gwendolyn shot her a look. "You wait too," she said, and went on reading. After a bit, she looked in the envelope again. "There's one for you too," she said to Cat, and tossed him a sheet of paper. "Mind you reply to it." Cat took it, wondering nervously why Mr. Nostrum should write to him. But it was from Mrs. Sharp. She wrote, "Me dear Cat, how are you doing then, me love? I find myself lonesome and missing you both, particular you. The place seems so quiet. Thought I was looking forward to a bit of peace, but missing your voice and wishing you was coming in bringing apples. One thing happened, and that was a gentleman come and give £5 for the old cat that was your fiddle. So I feel flush, and had idea of packing you up a parcel of gingerbread men, and maybe bringing them to you one of these days, but Mr. Nostrum says not to. 'Spect you're in the lap of luxury anyhows. Love to Gwendolyn. Wish you was back here, Cat, and the money means nothing. Your loving, Ellen Sharp." Cat read this with a warm, smiling, tearful feeling. He found he was missing Mrs. Sharp as much as she evidently missed him. He was so homesick he could not eat his bread, and the cocoa seemed to choke him. He did not hear 1 word in 5 that Mr. Saunders said. "Is something the matter with you, Eric?" Mr. Saunders demanded. As Cat dragged his mind back from Coven Street, the window blacked out. The room was suddenly pitch dark. Julia squeaked. Mr. Saunders groped his way to the switch and turned the light on. As he did so, the window became transparent again, revealing Roger grinning, Julia startled, Gwendolyn sitting demurely, and Mr. Saunders with his hand on the switch looking irritably at her. "I suppose the cause of this is outside the castle grounds, is it?" he said. "Outside the lodge gates," Gwendolyn said smugly. "I put it there this morning." By this, Cat knew her campaign against Chrestomanci had been launched. The window blacked out again. "How often are we to expect this?" Mr. Saunders said in the dark. "Twice every half hour," said Gwendolyn. "Thank you," Mr. Saunders said nastily, and he left the light on. "Now we can see, Gwendolyn, write out 100 times, 'I must keep the spirit of the law and not the letter.' And Roger, take that grin off your face." All that day, all the windows in the castle blacked out regularly, twice every half hour. But if Gwendolyn had hoped to make Chrestomanci angry, she did not succeed. Nothing happened, except that everyone kept the lights on all the time. It was rather a nuisance, but no one seemed to mind. Before lunch, Cat went outside onto the lawn to see what the blackouts looked like from the other side. It was rather as if 2 black shutters were flicking regularly across the rows of windows. They started at the top right-hand corner and flicked steadily across along the next row from left to right, and then from right to left along the next, and so on, until they reached the bottom. Then they started at the top again. Cat had watched about half a complete performance when he found Roger beside him, watching critically with his pudgy hands in his pockets. "Your sister must have a very tidy mind," Roger said. "I think all witches have," said Cat. Then he was embarrassed. Of course he was talking to one, or at least to a warlock in the making. "I don't seem to have," Roger remarked, not in the least worried. "Nor has Julia. And I don't think Michael has, really. Would you like to come and play in our treehouse after lessons?" Cat was very flattered. He was so pleased that he forgot how homesick he was. He spent a very happy evening down in the wood, helping to rebuild the roof of the treehouse. He came back to the castle when the dressing gong went, and found that the window spell was fading. When the windows darkened, it only produced a sort of grey twilight indoors. By the following morning it was gone, and Chrestomanci had not said a word. Gwendolyn returned to the attack the next morning. She caught the baker's boy as he cycled through the lodge gates with the square front container of his bicycle piled high with loaves for the castle. The baker's boy arrived at the kitchen looking a little dazed and saying his head felt swimmy. As a consequence, the children had to have scones for breakfast. It seemed that when the bread was cut, the most interesting things happened. "You're giving us all a good laugh," Mary said, as she brought the scones from the lift. "I'll say that for your naughtiness, Gwendolyn. Roberts thought he'd gone mad when he found he was cutting away at an old boot. So Cook cuts another, and next moment she and Nancy are trying to climb on the same chair because of all those white mice. But it was Mr. Fraser's face that made me laugh the most, when he says, 'Let me,' and finds himself chipping at a stone. Then the—" "Don't encourage her. You know what she's like," said Euphemia. "Be careful I don't start on you," Gwendolyn said sourly. Roger found out privately from Mary what had happened to the other loaves. One had become a white rabbit, one had been an ostrich egg, which had burst tremendously all over the boot boy, and another a vast white onion. After that, Gwendolyn's invention had run out, and she had turned the rest into cheese. "Old, bad cheese, though," Roger said, giving honour where honour was due. It was not known whether Chrestomanci also gave honour where it was due, because once again he said not a word to anyone. The next day was Saturday. Gwendolyn caught the farmer delivering the churn of milk the castle used daily. The breakfast cocoa tasted horrible. "I'm beginning to get annoyed," Julia said tartly. "Daddy may take no notice, but he drinks tea with lemon." She stared meaningly at Gwendolyn. Gwendolyn stared back. And there was that invisible feeling of clashing Cat had noticed when Gwendolyn had wanted her mother's earrings from Mrs. Sharp. This time, however, Gwendolyn did not have things all her own way. She lowered her eyes and looked peevish. "I'm getting sick of getting up early anyway," she said crossly. This, from Gwendolyn, simply meant she would do something later in the day in future. But Julia thought she had beaten Gwendolyn, and this was a mistake. They had lessons on Saturday morning, which annoyed Gwendolyn very much. "It's monstrous," she said to Mr. Saunders. "Why do we have to be tormented like this?" "It's the price I have to pay for my holiday on Wednesday," Mr. Saunders told her. "And speaking of tormenting, I prefer you to bewitch something other than the milk." "I'll remember that," Gwendolyn said sweetly. Chapter 7. It rained on Saturday afternoon. Gwendolyn shut herself into her room, and once again Cat did not know what to do. He wrote to Mrs. Sharp on the back of his postcard of the castle, but that only took 10 minutes, and it was too wet to go out and mail it. Cat was hanging about at the foot of his stairs, wondering what to do now, when Roger came out of the playroom and saw him. "Oh, good," said Roger. "Julia won't play soldiers, will you?" "But I can't, not like you do," Cat said. "It doesn't matter," said Roger, "honestly." But it did. No matter how cunningly Cat deployed his lifeless tin army, as soon as Roger's soldiers began to march, Cat's men fell over like ninepins. They fell in batches and droves and in battalions. Cat moved them furiously this way and that, grabbing them by handfuls and scooping them with the lid of the box. But he was always on the retreat. In 5 minutes he was reduced to 3 soldiers hidden behind a cushion. "This is no good," said Roger. "No, it isn't," Cat agreed mournfully. "Julia," said Roger. "What?" said Julia. She was curled in the shabbiest armchair, managing to suck a lollipop, to read a book called In the Hands of the Lamas, and to knit all at the same time. Her knitting, hardly surprisingly, looked like a vest for a giraffe which had been dipped in 6 shades of grey dye. "Can you make Cat soldiers move for him?" said Roger. "I'm reading," said Julia, around the edges of the lollipop. "It's thrilling. One of them's got lost, and they think he's perished miserably." "Be a sport," said Roger. "I'll tell you whether he did perish if you don't." "If you do, I'll turn your underpants to ice," Julia said amiably. "All right." Without taking her eyes off her book or the lollipop out of her mouth, she fumbled out her handkerchief and tied a knot in it. She laid the knotted handkerchief on the arm of her chair and went on knitting. Cat's fallen soldiers picked themselves up from the floor and straightened their tin tunics. This was a great improvement, though it was still not entirely satisfactory. Cat could not tell his soldiers what to do. He had to shoo them into position with his hands. The soldiers did not seem happy. They looked up at the great flapping hands above them in the greatest consternation. Cat was sure one fainted from terror. But he got them positioned in the end, with great cunning, he thought. The battle began. The soldiers seemed to know how to do that for themselves. Cat had a company in reserve behind a cushion, and when the battle was at its fiercest, he shooed them out to fall on Roger's right wing. Roger's right wing turned and fought, and every one of Cat's reserve turned and ran. The rest of his army saw them running away and ran too. In 3 seconds they were all trying to hide in the toy cupboard, and Roger's soldiers were cutting them down in swaths. Roger was exasperated. "Julia's soldiers always run away." "Because that's just what I would do," Julia said, putting out a knitting needle to mark her place in her book. "I can't think why all soldiers don't." "Well, make them a bit braver," said Roger. "It's not fair on Eric." "You only said make them move," Julia was arguing, when the door opened and Gwendolyn put her head in. "I want Cat," she said. "He's busy," said Roger. "That doesn't matter," said Gwendolyn. "I need him." Julia stretched out a knitting needle toward Gwendolyn and wrote a little cross in the air with it. The cross floated, glowing, for a second. "Out," said Julia. "Go away." Gwendolyn backed away from the cross and shut the door again. It was as if she could not help herself. The expression on her face was very annoyed indeed. Julia smiled placidly and pointed her knitting needle toward Cat's soldiers. "Carry on," she said. "I've filled their hearts with courage." When the dressing gong sounded, Cat went to find out what Gwendolyn had wanted him for. Gwendolyn was very busy reading a fat, new-looking book and could not spare him any attention at first. Cat tipped his head sideways and read the title of the book. Otherworld Studies, Series 3. While he was doing it, Gwendolyn began to laugh. "Oh, I see how it works now," she exclaimed. "It's even better than I thought. I know what to do now." Then she lowered the book and asked Cat what he thought he was doing. "Why did you need me?" said Cat. "Where did you get that book?" "From the castle library," said Gwendolyn. "And I don't need you now. I was going to explain to you about Mr. Nostrum's plans, and I might even have told you about mine. But I changed my mind when you just sat there and let that fat prig Julia send me away." "I didn't know Mr. Nostrum had any plans," Cat said. "The dressing gong's gone." "Of course he has plans, and I heard it. Why do you think I wrote to Chrestomanci?" said Gwendolyn. "But it's no good trying to wheedle me. I'm not going to tell you, and you're going to be sorry. And Piggy Priggy Julia is going to be sorrier even sooner." Gwendolyn revenged herself on Julia at the start of dinner. A footman was just passing a bowl of soup over Julia's shoulder when the skirt of Julia's dress turned to snakes. Julia jumped up with a shriek. Soup poured over the snakes and flew far and wide, and the footman yelled, "Lord have mercy on us!" among the sounds of the smashing soup bowl. Then there was dead silence, except for the hissing of snakes. There were 20 of them, hanging by their tails from Julia's waistband, writhing and striking. Everyone froze, with their heads stiffly turned Julia's way. Julia stood like a statue, with her arms up out of reach of the snakes. She swallowed and said the words of a spell. Nobody blamed her. Mr. Saunders said, "Good girl." Under the spell, the snakes stiffened and fanned out, so that they were standing like a ballet skirt above Julia's petticoats. Everyone could see where Julia had torn a flounce of a petticoat building the treehouse and mended it in a hurry with red darning wool. "Have you been bitten?" said Chrestomanci. "No," said Julia. "The soup muddled them. If you don't mind, I'll go and change this dress now." She left the room, walking very slowly and carefully, and Milly went with her. While the footmen, all rather green in the face, were clearing up the spilled soup, Chrestomanci said, "Spitefulness is one thing I won't have at the dinner table. Gwendolyn, oblige me by going to the playroom. Your food will be brought to you there." Gwendolyn got up and went without a word. As Julia and Milly did not come back, the dining table seemed rather empty that evening. It was all stocks and shares from Bernard at one end, and statues again from Mr. Saunders at the other. Cat found that Gwendolyn was rather triumphant. She felt she had made an impression on Chrestomanci at last, so she returned to the attack with a will on Sunday. On Sunday, the family dressed in its best and walked down to morning service at the village church. Witches are not supposed to like church, nor are they supposed to be able to work magic there, but this never bothered Gwendolyn at all. Mrs. Sharp had many times remarked on it, as showing what exceptional talents Gwendolyn had. Gwendolyn sat next to Cat in the Chrestomanci pew, looking the picture of demure innocence in her broidery anglaise Sunday dress and hat, and found her place in her prayer book as if she were truly saintly. The village people nudged one another and whispered about her. This rather pleased Gwendolyn. She liked to be well known. She kept up the pretence of saintliness until the sermon had begun. The vicar climbed shakily into the pulpit and gave his text in a weak, wandering voice. "For there were many in the congregation that were not sanctified." This was certainly to the point. Unfortunately, nothing else he said was. He told in his weak, wandering voice of weak, wandering episodes in his early life. He compared them with weak, wandering things he thought were happening in the world today. He told them they had better be sanctified, or all sorts of things, which he forgot to mention, would happen, which reminded him of a weak, wandering thing his aunts used to tell him. Mr. Saunders was asleep by this time, and so was Stocks and Shares Bernard. The old lady with mittens was nodding. One of the saints in the stained-glass windows yawned and put up his crozier elegantly to cover his mouth. He looked around at his neighbour, who was a formidable nun. Her robes hung in severe folds like a bundle of sticks. The bishop stretched out his stained-glass crozier and tapped the nun on the shoulder. She resented it. She marched into his window and began shaking him. Cat saw her. He saw the coloured, transparent bishop clouting the nun over the wimple, and the nun giving him as good as she got. Meanwhile, the hairy saint next to them made a dive for his neighbour, who was a kingly sort of saint, holding a model of the castle. The kingly saint dropped his model and fled for protection in a twinkle of glassy feet behind the robes of a simpering lady saint. The hairy saint jumped gleefully up and down on the model of the castle. One by one, all the windows came to life. Almost every saint turned and fought the one next to him. Those who had no one to fight either hitched up their robes and did silly dances or waved to the vicar, who rambled on without noticing. The little tiny people blowing trumpets in the corners of the windows sprang and gambolled and frisked and pulled transparent faces at anyone who was looking. The hairy saint winkled the kingly one out from behind the simpering lady and chased him from window to window, in and out of all the other fighting couples. By this time the whole congregation had seen. Everyone stared or whispered or leaned, craning this way and that to watch the twinkling glass toes of the kingly saint. There was such a disturbance that Mr. Saunders woke up, puzzled. He looked at the windows, understood, and looked sharply at Gwendolyn. She sat with her eyes demurely cast down, the picture of innocence. Cat glanced at Chrestomanci. For all he could tell, Chrestomanci was attending to the vicar's every word and had not even noticed the windows. Milly was sitting on the edge of her seat looking agitated, and the vicar still rambled on, quite unconscious of the turmoil. The curate, however, felt he ought to put a stop to the unseemly behaviour of the windows. He fetched a cross and a candle. Followed by a giggling choir-boy swinging incense, he went from window to window murmuring exorcisms. Gwendolyn obligingly stopped each saint in its tracks as he came to it, which meant that the kingly saint was stranded halfway across the wall. But as soon as the curate's back was turned, he began to run again, and the free-for-all went on more riotously than before. The congregation rolled about, gasping. Chrestomanci turned and looked at Mr. Saunders. Mr. Saunders nodded. There was a sort of flicker which jolted Cat where he sat, and when he looked at the windows, every saint was standing stiff and glassy there, as they should be. Gwendolyn's head came up indignantly. Then she shrugged. At the back of the church, a great stone crusader sat up on his tomb, and, with much rasping of stone, thumbed his nose at the vicar. "Dearly beloved," said the vicar. He saw the crusader. He stopped, confounded. The curate hastened up and tried to exorcise the crusader. A look of irritation crossed the crusader's face. He lifted his great stone sword, but Mr. Saunders made a sharp gesture. The crusader, looking even more irritated, lowered his sword and lay down again with a thump that shook the church. "There are some in this congregation who are certainly not sanctified," the vicar said sadly. "Let us pray." When everyone straggled out of church, Gwendolyn sauntered out among them, quite impervious to the shocked looks everyone gave her as she passed. Milly hurried after her and seized her arm. She looked most upset. "That was disgraceful, you ungodly child! I don't dare speak to the poor vicar. There is such a thing as going too far, you know." "Have I gone it?" Gwendolyn asked, really interested. "Very nearly," said Milly. But not quite, it seemed. Chrestomanci did not say anything to Gwendolyn, though he said a great deal very soothingly, both to the vicar and to the curate. "Why doesn't your father tell Gwendolyn off?" Cat asked Roger as they walked back up the avenue. "Taking no notice of her just makes her worse." "I don't know," said Roger. "He comes down on us hard enough if we use witchcraft. Perhaps he thinks she'll get tired of it. Has she told you what she's going to do tomorrow?" It was clear Roger could hardly wait. "No, she's cross with me for playing soldiers with you," said Cat. "Her stupid fault for thinking she owns you," said Roger. "Let's get into old clothes and build some more of the treehouse." Gwendolyn was angry when Cat went off with Roger again. Maybe that was why she thought of what she did next. Or perhaps, as she said, she had other reasons. At all events, when Cat woke up on Monday morning, it was dark. It felt very early. It looked even earlier. So Cat turned over and went to sleep again. He was astonished to find Mary shaking him a minute later. "It's 20 to 9, Eric. Get up, do." "But it's dark," Cat protested. "Is it raining?" "No," said Mary. "Your sister's been hard at it again, and where she gets the strength from, a little girl like her beats me." Feeling tired and Mondayish, Cat dragged himself out of bed and found he could not see out of the windows. Each window was a dark crisscross of branches and leaves, green leaves, bluish cedar sprays, pine needles, and leaves just turning yellow and brown. One window had a rose pressed against it, and there were bunches of grapes squashed on both of the others. And behind them it looked as if there was a mile-thick forest. "Good Lord," he said. "You may well look," said Mary. "That sister of yours has fetched every tree in the grounds and stood them as close as they can get to the castle. You wonder what she'll think of next." The darkness made Cat weary and gloomy. He did not want to get dressed, but Mary stood over him and made him wash too. The reason she was so dutiful, Cat suspected, was that she wanted to tell someone all about the difficulties the trees were causing. She told Cat that the yew trees from the formal garden were packed so tight by the kitchen door that the men had to hack a path for the milk to come through. There were 3 oak trees against the main front door, and no one could budge it. "And the apples are all underfoot among the yew trees, so it smells like a cider press in the kitchen," Mary said. When Cat arrived wearily in the playroom, it was even darker there. In the deep greenish light he could see that Gwendolyn was, understandably, white and tired, but she looked satisfied enough. "I don't think I like these trees," Cat whispered to her when Roger and Julia had gone through to the schoolroom. "Why couldn't you do something smaller and funnier?" "Because I'm not a laughing stock," Gwendolyn hissed back, "and I needed to do it. I had to know how much power I could draw on." "Quite a lot, I should think," Cat said, looking at the mass of horse-chestnut leaves pressed against the window. Gwendolyn smiled. "Better still when I've got my dragon's blood." Cat nearly blurted out that he had seen dragon's blood in Mr. Saunders' workshop, but he stopped himself in time. He did not care for mighty works like this. They spent another morning with the lights on, and at lunchtime Cat, Julia and Roger went out to have a look at the trees. They were disappointed to find that it was quite easy to get out of their private door. The rhododendrons were 3 feet away from it. Cat thought Gwendolyn must intentionally have left them a way out, until he looked up and saw from their bent branches and mashed leaves that the bushes had indeed been squashed against the door earlier. It looked as if the trees were retreating. Beyond the rhododendrons, they had to fight their way through something like a jungle. The trees were rammed so tight that not only had twigs and leaves broken off by cartloads, but great branches had been torn away too, and fallen tangled with smashed roses, broken clematis, and mangled grapes. When the children tore themselves out on the other side of the jungle, blank daylight hit them like a hammer blow. They blinked. The gardens, the village, and even the hills beyond were bald. The only place where they could still see trees was above the old grey ruined wall of Chrestomanci's garden. "It must have been a strong spell," said Roger. "It's like a desert," said Julia. "I never thought I'd miss the trees so much." But halfway through the afternoon, it became clear that the trees were going back to their proper places. They could see sky through the schoolroom window. A little later, the trees had spread out and retreated so much that Mr. Saunders turned the light off. Shortly after that, Cat and Roger noticed the ruins of the tree house, smashed to bits in the crowding dangling out of a chestnut tree. "Now, what are you staring at?" said Mr. Saunders. "The tree house is broken," Roger said, looking moodily at Gwendolyn. "Perhaps Gwendolyn would be kind enough to mend it again," Mr. Saunders suggested sarcastically. If he was trying to goad Gwendolyn into doing a kindly act, he failed. Gwendolyn tossed her head. "Tree houses are stupid, babyish things," she said coldly. She was very annoyed at the way the trees were retreating. "It's too bad," she told Cat just before dinner. By that time the trees were almost back to their usual places. The only ones nearer than they should be were those on the hill opposite. The view looked smaller, somehow. "I hoped it would do for tomorrow, too," Gwendolyn said discontentedly. "Now I shall have to think of something else." "Who sent them back? The garden warlocks?" Cat asked. "I wish you wouldn't talk nonsense," said Gwendolyn. "It's obvious who did it." "You mean Mr. Saunders?" said Cat. "But couldn't the spell have been used up, just pulling all the trees here?" "You don't know a thing about it," said Gwendolyn. Cat knew he knew nothing of magic, but he found it queer all the same. The next day, when he went to see, there were no fallen twigs, torn-off branches, or squashed grapes anywhere. The yew trees in the formal garden did not seem to have been hacked at all. And though there was not a trace of an apple underfoot around the kitchen, there were boxes of firm, round apples in the courtyard. In the orchard, the apples were all either hanging on the trees or being picked and put in more boxes. While Cat was finding this out, he had to flatten himself hastily against one of the hedge-like apple trees to make way for a galloping Jersey cow pursued by 2 gardeners and a farm boy. There were cows galloping in the wood when Cat went hopefully to look at the treehouse. Alas, that was still a ruin, and the cows were doing their best to ruin the flower beds and not making much impression. "Did you do the cows?" he asked Gwendolyn. "Yes, but it was just something to show them I'm not giving up," said Gwendolyn. "I shall get my dragon's blood tomorrow, and then I can do something really impressive." Chapter 8. Gwendolyn went down to the village to get her dragon's blood on Wednesday afternoon. She was in high glee. There were to be guests that night at the castle and a big dinner party. Cat knew that everyone had carefully not mentioned it before, for fear Gwendolyn would take advantage of it. But she had to be told on Wednesday morning, because there were special arrangements for the children. They were to have their supper in the playroom, and they were supposed to keep out of the way after that. "I'll keep out of the way, all right," Gwendolyn promised, "but that won't make any difference." She chuckled about it all the way to the village. Cat was embarrassed when they got to the village. Everyone avoided Gwendolyn. Mothers dragged their children indoors and snatched babies out of her way. Gwendolyn hardly noticed. She was too intent on getting to Mr. Baslam and getting her dragon's blood. Cat did not fancy Mr. Baslam, or the decaying pickle smell among his stuffed animals. He let Gwendolyn go there on her own, and went to mail his postcard to Mrs. Sharp in the sweet shop. The people there were rather cool with him, even though he spent nearly 2 shillings on sweets, and they were positively cold in the cake shop next door. When Cat came out onto the green with his parcels, he found that children were being snatched out of his way too. This so shamed Cat that he fled back to the castle grounds and did not wait for Gwendolyn. There he wandered moodily, eating toffees and penny buns, and wishing he was back with Mrs. Sharp. From time to time he saw Gwendolyn in the distance. Sometimes she was dashing about, sometimes she was squatting under a tree, carefully doing something. Cat did not go near her. If they were back with Mrs. Sharp, he thought, Gwendolyn would not need to do whatever impressive thing she was planning. He found himself wishing she was not quite such a strong and determined witch. He tried to imagine a Gwendolyn who was not a witch, but he found himself quite unable to. She just would not be Gwendolyn. Indoors, the usual silence of the castle was not quite the same. There were tense little noises, and the thrumming feeling of people diligently busy just out of earshot. Cat knew it was going to be a big, important dinner party. After supper, he craned out of Gwendolyn's window, watching the guests come up the piece of avenue he could see from there. They came in carriages and in cars, all very large and rich-looking. One carriage was drawn by 6 white horses and looked so impressive that Cat wondered if it might not even be the king. "All the better," said Gwendolyn. She was squatting in the middle of the carpet beside a sheet of paper. At one end of the paper was a bowl of ingredients. At the other crawled, wriggled, or lay a horrid heap of things. Gwendolyn had collected 2 frogs, an earthworm, several earwigs, a black beetle, a spider, and a little pile of bones. The live things were charmed and could not move off the paper. As soon as Cat was sure that there were no more carriages arriving, Gwendolyn began pounding the ingredients together in the bowl. As she pounded, she muttered things in a groaning hum, and her hair hung down and quivered over the bowl. Cat looked at the wriggling, hopping creatures and hoped that they were not going to be pounded up as ingredients too. It seemed not. Gwendolyn at length sat back on her heels and said, "Now." She snapped her fingers over the bowl. The ingredients caught fire all by themselves and burned with small blue flames. "It's working!" Gwendolyn said excitedly. She snatched up a twist of newspaper from beside her and carefully untwisted it. "Now for a pinch of dragon's blood." She took a pinch of the dark brown powder and sprinkled it on the flames. There was a fizzing and a thick smell of burning. Then the flames leaped up 1 foot high, blazing a furious green and purple, colouring the whole room with dancing light. Gwendolyn's face glowed in the green and purple. She rocked on her heels, chanting strings of things Cat could not understand. Then, still chanting, she leaned over and touched the spider. The spider grew, and grew, and grew more. It grew into a 5-foot monster, a greasy roundness with 2 little eyes on the front, hanging like a hammock amid 8 bent and jointed furry legs. Gwendolyn pointed. The door of her room sprang open of its own accord, which made her smile exultantly, and the huge spider went silently creeping toward it, swaying on its hairy legs. It squeezed its legs inward to get through the door and crept onward, down the passage beyond. Gwendolyn touched the other creatures one by one. The earwigs lumbered up and off like shiny horned cows, bright brown and glistening. The frogs rose up as big as men and walked flap, flop on their enormous feet with their arms trailing like gorillas. Their mottled skin quivered, and little holes in it kept opening and shutting. The puffy place under their chins made gulping movements. The black beetle crawled on branched legs, such a big black slab that it could barely get through the door. Cat could see it, and all the others, going in a slow, silent procession down the grass-green, glowing corridor. "Where are they going?" he whispered, Gwendolyn chuckled. "I'm sending them to the dining room, of course. I don't think the guests will want much supper." She took up a bone next and knocked each end of it sharply on the floor. As soon as she let go of it, it floated up into the air. There was a soft clattering, and more bones came out of nowhere to join it. The green and purple flames roared and rasped. A skull arrived last of all, and a complete skeleton was dangling there in front of the flames. Gwendolyn smiled with satisfaction and took up another bone. But bones, when they are bewitched, have a way of remembering who they were. The dangling skeleton sighed in a hollow, singing voice. "Poor Sarah Jane, I'm poor Sarah Jane, let me rest." Gwendolyn waved it impatiently towards the door. It went dangling off, still sighing, and a second skeleton dangled after it, sighing, "Bob the gardener's boy, I didn't mean to do it." They were followed by 3 more, each one singing softly and desolately of who it had been, and all 5 went slowly dangling after the black beetle. "Sarah Jane," Cat heard from the corridor. "I didn't mean to. I was Duke of Buckingham once." Gwendolyn took no notice of them, and turned to the earthworm. It grew too. It grew into a massive pink thing as big as a sea serpent. Loops of it rose and fell and writhed all over the room. Cat was nearly sick. Its bare pink flesh had hairs on it like a pig's bristles. There were rings on it like the wrinkles around his own knuckles. Its great sightless front turned blindly this way and that until Gwendolyn pointed to the door. Then it set off slowly after the skeletons, length after length of bare pink loops. Gwendolyn looked after it critically. "Not bad," she said. "I need one last touch, though." Carefully, she dropped another tiny pinch of dragon's blood on the flames. They burned with a whistling sound, brighter, sicker, yellower. Gwendolyn began to chant again, waving her arms this time. After a moment, a shape seemed to be gathering in the quivering air over the flames. Whiteness was boiling, moving, forming into a miserable bent thing with a big head. 3 more somethings were roiling and hardening beneath it. When the first thing flopped out of the flames onto the carpet, Gwendolyn gave a gurgle of pleasure. Cat was amazed at how wicked she looked. "Oh, don't," he said. The 3 other somethings flopped onto the carpet too, and he saw they were the apparition at the window and 3 others like it. The first was like a baby that was too small to walk, except that it was walking, with its big head wobbling. The next was a cripple, so twisted and cramped upon itself that it could barely hobble. The third was the apparition at the window, pitiful, wrinkled, and draggled. The last had its white skin barred with blue stripes. All were weak and white and horrible. Cat shuddered all over. "Please send them away," he said. Gwendolyn only laughed again and waved the 4 apparitions toward the door. They set off, toiling weakly. But they were only halfway there when Chrestomanci came through the door and Mr. Saunders came after him. In front of them came a shower of bones and small dead creatures, pattering onto the carpet and getting squashed under Chrestomanci's long, shiny shoes. The apparitions hesitated, gibbering. Then they fled back to the flaming bowl and vanished. The flames vanished at the same time into thick, black, smelly smoke. Gwendolyn stared at Chrestomanci and Mr. Saunders through the smoke. Chrestomanci was magnificent in dark blue velvet, with lace ruffles at his wrists and on the front of his shirt. Mr. Saunders seemed to have made an effort to find a suit that reached to the ends of his legs and arms, but had not quite succeeded. One of his big, black patent leather boots was unlaced, and there was a lot of shirt and wrist showing as he slowly coiled an invisible skein of something around his bony right hand. Both he and Chrestomanci looked back at Gwendolyn most unpleasantly. "You were warned, you know," Chrestomanci said. "Carry on, Michael." Mr. Saunders put the invisible skein in his pocket. "Thanks," he said. "I've been itching to for a week now." He strode down on Gwendolyn in a billow of black coat, yanked her to her feet, hauled her to a chair, and put her face down over his knee. There he dragged off his unlaced big black boot and commenced spanking her with it hard and often. While Mr. Saunders laboured away and Gwendolyn screamed and squirmed and kicked, Chrestomanci marched up to Cat and boxed Cat's ears twice on each side. Cat was so surprised that he would have fallen over had not Chrestomanci hit the other side of his head each time and brought him upright again. "What did you do that for?" Cat said indignantly, clutching both sides of his ringing face. "I didn't do anything." "That's why I hit you," said Chrestomanci. "You didn't try to stop her, did you?" While Cat was gasping at the unfairness of this, he turned to the labouring Mr. Saunders. "I think that'll do now, Michael." Mr. Saunders ceased swatting, rather regretfully. Gwendolyn slid to her knees on the floor, sobbing with pain and making screams in between her sobs at being treated like this. Chrestomanci went over and poked at her with his shiny foot. "Stop it. Get up and behave yourself." And when Gwendolyn rose to her knees, staring piteously and looking utterly wronged, he said, "You thoroughly deserved that spanking, and as you probably realise, Michael has taken away your witchcraft too. You're not a witch any longer. In future you are not going to work one spell unless you can prove to both of us that you are not going to do mischief with it. Is that clear? Now go to bed, and for goodness sake try and think about what you've been doing." He nodded to Mr. Saunders, and they both went out. Mr. Saunders hopping because he was still putting his boot back on, and squashing the rest of the dead creatures as he hopped. Gwendolyn flopped forward on her face and drummed her toes on the carpet. "The beast! The beasts! How dare they treat me like this? I shall do a worse thing than this now, and serve you all right." "But you can't do things without witchcraft," Cat said. "Was what Mr. Saunders was winding up your witchcraft?" "Go away!" Gwendolyn screamed at him. "Leave me alone! You're as bad as the rest of them!" And as Cat went to the door, leaving her drumming and sobbing, she raised her head and shouted after him, "I'm not beaten yet! You'll see!" Not surprisingly, Cat had bad dreams that night. They were terrible dreams, full of giant earthworms and great, slimy, porous frogs. They became more and more feverish. Cat sweated and moaned, and finally woke up, feeling wet and weak and rather too bony, the way you do when you have just had a bad illness or a fearsome dream. He lay for a little while, feeling wretched. Then he began to feel better, and fell asleep again. When Cat woke again, it was light. He opened his eyes on the snowy silence of the castle, and was suddenly convinced that Gwendolyn had done something else. He had no idea what made him so sure. He thought he was probably imagining it. If Mr. Saunders had truly taken Gwendolyn's witchcraft away from her, she could not have done a thing. But he still knew she had. He got up and padded to the windows to see what it was. But for once there was nothing abnormal about the view from any of them. The cedars spread above the lawn, the gardens blazed down the hill. The day was swimming in sun and mist, and not so much as a footprint marked the pearly grey-green of the grass. But Cat was still so sure that something, somewhere, was different, that he got dressed and stole off downstairs to ask Gwendolyn what she had done. When Cat opened the door of her room, he could smell the sweet, charred, heavy smell that went with witchcraft. But that could have been left over from last night. The room was quite tidy. The dead creatures and the burned bowl had been cleared away. The only thing out of place was Gwendolyn's box, which had been pulled out of the painted wardrobe and stood with its lid half off near her bed. Gwendolyn was a sleeping hump under the blue velvet bedspread. Cat shut the door very gently behind him in order not to disturb her. Gwendolyn heard it. She sat up in bed with a bounce and stared at him. As soon as she did, Cat knew that whatever was wrong, it was wrong with Gwendolyn herself. She had a nightdress on, back to front. The ribbons, which usually tied it at the back, were dangling at the front. That was the only thing obviously wrong. But there was something odd about the way Gwendolyn was staring at him. She was astonished and rather frightened. "Who are you?" she said. "I'm Cat, of course," said Cat. "No, you're not. You're a boy," said Gwendolyn. "Who are you?" Cat realized that when witches lost their witchcraft, they also lost their memories. He saw he would have to be very patient with Gwendolyn. "I'm your brother, Eric," he said patiently, and came across to the bed so that she could look at him. "Only you always call me Cat." "My brother?" she exclaimed in the greatest astonishment. "Well, that can't be bad. I've always wanted a brother. And I know I can't be dreaming. It was too cold in the bath, and it hurts when I pinch myself. So would you mind telling me where I am? It's a stately home of some kind, isn't it?" Cat stared at her. He began to suspect that her memory was perfectly good. It was not only the way she spoke and what she said. She was thinner than she should be. Her face was the right, pretty face, with the right blue eyes. But the downright look on it was not right. The golden hair hanging over her shoulders was an inch longer than it had been last night. "You're not Gwendolyn?" he said. "What a dreadful name," said the girl in the bed. "I should hope not. I'm Janet Chant." Chapter 9. By this time, Cat was as bewildered as the strange girl seemed to be. "Chant?" he thought. "Chant? Has Gwendolyn a twin sister she hasn't told me about? But my name's Chant too," he said. "Is it now?" said Janet. She knelt up in bed and scrubbed her hands thoughtfully about in her hair, in a way Gwendolyn never would have done. "Truly, Chant? It's not that much of a common name. And you thought I was your sister? Well, I've put 2 and 2 together about 100 times since I woke up in the bath, and I keep getting 5. Where are we?" "In Chrestomanci Castle," said Cat. "Chrestomanci had us to live here about a year after our parents died." "There you are," said Janet. "My mum and dad are alive and kicking, or they were when I said good night to them last night. Who's Chrestomanci? Could you just sketch your life history for me?" Puzzled and uneasy, Cat described how and why he and Gwendolyn had come to live in the castle, and what Gwendolyn had done then. "You mean Gwendolyn really was a witch?" Janet exclaimed. Cat wished she had not said was. He had a growing suspicion that he would never see the real Gwendolyn again. "Of course she is," he said. "Aren't you?" "Great heavens, no!" said Janet, "though I'm beginning to wonder if I mightn't have been if I'd lived here all my life. Witches are quite common, are they?" "And warlocks and necromancers," said Cat. "But wizards and magicians don't happen so often. I think Mr. Saunders is a magician." "Medicine men, witch doctors, shamans, devils, enchanters?" Janet asked rapidly. "Hags, fakers, sorcerers? Are they thick on the ground too?" "Most of those are for savages," Cat explained. "Hag is rude. But we have sorcerers and enchanters. Enchanters are very strong and important. I've never met one." "I see," said Janet. She thought for a moment, and then swung herself out of bed in a sort of scramble that was more like a boy's than a girl's, and again quite unlike the way Gwendolyn would have done it. "We'd better have a hunt around," she said, "in case dear Gwendolyn has been kind enough to leave a message." "Don't call her that," Kat said desolately. "Where do you think she is?" Janet looked at him and saw he was miserable. "Sorry," she said. "I won't again. But you do see I might be a bit cross with her, don't you? She seems to have dumped me here and gone off somewhere. Let's hope she has a good explanation." "They spanked her with a boot and took away her magic," Kat said. "Yes, you said," Janet replied, pulling open drawers in the golden dressing table. "I'm terrified of Chrestomanci already. But did they really take away her magic? How did she manage to do this, if they did?" "I don't understand that either," Kat said, joining in the search. By now he would have given his little finger for a word from Gwendolyn, any kind of word. He felt horribly lonely. "Why were you in the bath?" he said, wondering whether to search the bathroom. "I don't know. I just woke up there," said Janet, shaking out a tangle of hair ribbons in the bottom drawer. "I felt as if I'd been dragged through a hedge backward, and I'd no clothes on, so I was freezing." "Why had you no clothes on?" Kat said, stirring Gwendolyn's underclothes about, without success. "I was hot in bed last night," said Janet. "So, naked, I came into this world. And I wandered about, pinching myself, especially after I found this fabulous room. I thought I must have been turned into a princess. But there was this nightdress lying on the bed, so I put it on." "You've got it on back to front," said Kat. Janet stopped scanning the things on the mantelpiece to look down at the trailing ribbons. "Have I? It won't be the only thing I'm going to get back to front by the sound of it. Try looking in that artistic wardrobe." Then I explored outside here, and all I found was miles of long green corridor, which gave me the creeps, and stately grounds out of the windows. So I came back in here and went to bed. I hoped that when I woke up it would all have gone away. And instead there was you. Found anything?" "No," said Kat. "But there's her box." "It must be in there," said Janet. They squatted down and unpacked the box. There was not much in it. Kat knew that Gwendolyn must have taken a lot of things with her to wherever she had gone. There were 2 books, Elementary Spells and Magic for Beginners, and some pages of notes on them. Janet looked at Gwendolyn's large round writing. "She writes just like I do. Why did she leave these books?" "Because they're first form standard and she's up to O-levels, I suppose." She put the books and notes to one side, and as she did so, the little red book of matches fell out from among them. Janet picked it up and opened it, and saw that half the matches were burned without having been torn out. "That looks suspiciously like a spell to me," she said. "What are these bundles of letters?" "My parents' love letters, I think," said Kat. The letters were in their envelopes still, stamped and addressed. Janet squatted with a bundle in each hand. "These stamps are penny blacks. No, it's a man's head on them. What's your king called?" "Charles the 7th, said Kat. "No Georges?" Janet asked. But she saw Kat was mystified, and looked back at the letters again. "Your mother and father were both called Chant, I see. Were they first cousins?" "Mine are. Granny didn't want them to marry, because it's supposed to be a bad thing." "I don't know. They may have been. They looked rather alike," Kat said, and felt lonelier than ever. Janet looked rather lonely too. She tucked the little book of matches carefully inside the pink tape that tied together the letters addressed to Miss Caroline Chant. Like Gwendolyn, she evidently had a tidy mind, and said, "Both tall and fair with blue eyes. My mum's name is Caroline too." "I'm beginning to see." "Come on, Gwendolyn, give!" And saying this, Janet tossed aside the letters, and in a most untidy way scrabbled up the remaining folders, papers, writing sets, pen wipers, and the bag with souvenir from Blackpool on it. At the very bottom of the box was a large pink sheet of paper, covered all over with Gwendolyn's best and roundest writing. "Ah," said Janet, pouncing on it. "I thought so. She's got the same secretive mind as I have." And she spread the letter on the carpet so that Cat could read it too. Gwendolyn had written, "Dear Replacement, I have to leave this terrible place. Nobody understands me. Nobody notices my talents. You will soon see, because you are my exact double, so you will be a witch too. I have been very clever. They do not know all my resources. I have found out how to go to another world, and I am going there for good. I know I shall be queen of it because my fortune was told and said so. There are hundreds of other worlds, only some are nicer than others. They are formed when there is a big event in history, like a battle or an earthquake, when the result can be two or more quite different things. Both those things happen, but they cannot exist together. So the world splits into two worlds which start to go different after that. I know there must be Gwendolyns in a lot of worlds, but not how many. One of you will come here when I go, because when I move, it will make an empty space that will suck you in. Do not grieve, however, if your parents still live. Some other Gwendolyn will move into your place and pretend to be you, because we are all so clever. You can carry on here, making Chrestomanci's life a misery, and I shall be grateful, knowing it is in good hands. Your loving, Gwendolyn Chant. P.S. Burn this. P.S. 2. Tell Cat I am quite sorry, but he must do what Mr. Nostrum says." Having read this, Cat knelt wanly beside Janet, knowing he really would never see Gwendolyn again. He seemed to be stuck with Janet instead. If you know a person as well as Cat knew Gwendolyn, an exact double is hardly good enough. Janet was not a witch. The expressions on her face were nothing like the same. Looking at her now, Cat saw that where Gwendolyn would have been furious at being dragged into another world, Janet was looking as wan as he felt. "I wonder how Mum and Dad are getting on with my dear replacement," she said wryly. Then she pulled herself together. "Do you mind if I don't burn this? It's the only proof I've got that I'm not Gwendolyn who's suddenly gone mad and thinks she's this girl called Janet Chant. May I hide it?" "It's your letter," said Cat. "And your sister," said Janet. God bless her dear little sugar-coated shining soul. Don't get me wrong, Cat, I admire your sister. She thinks big. You have to admire her. All the same, I wonder if she's thought of the clever hiding place where I'm going to put her letter. I shall feel better if she hasn't." Janet bounced up in her un-Gwendolyn-like way and took the letter over to the gilded dressing table. Cat bounced up and followed her. Janet took hold of the gold-garlanded mirror and swung it towards her on its swivels. The back was plain plywood. She dug her nails under the edge of the plywood and prized. It came free quite easily. "I do this with my mirror at home," Janet explained. "It's a good hiding place. It's about the one place my parents never think of. Mum and Dad are dears, but they're terribly nosy. I think it's because I'm their only one. And I like to be private. I write private stories for my eyes only, and they will try to read them. Oh, purple spotted Dalmatians!" She raised the wood up and showed Cat the signs painted on the red-coated back of the glass itself. "Kabbalah, I think," said Cat. "It's a spell." "So she did think of it," said Janet. "Really, it's hell having a double. You both get the same ideas." "And working on that principle," she said, sliding Gwendolyn's letter between the plywood and the glass and pressing the plywood back in place, "I bet I know what the spell's for. It's so Gwendolyn can have a look from time to time and see how dear Replacement's getting on. I hope she's looking now." Janet swung the mirror back to its usual position and crossed her eyes at it hideously. She took hold of the corners of her crossed eyes and pulled them long and Chinese and stuck her tongue out as far as it would go. Then she pushed her nose up with one finger and twisted her mouth right around to one cheek. Kat could not help laughing. "Can't Gwendolyn do this?" Janet said out of the side of her face. "No," Kat giggled. That was the moment when Euphemia opened the door. Janet jumped violently. She was much more nervous than Kat had realized. "I'll thank you to stop pulling faces," said Euphemia, "and get out of your nightdress, Gwendolyn." She came into the room to make sure that Gwendolyn did. She gave a croaking sort of shriek. Then she melted into a brown lump. Janet's hands went over her mouth. She and Kat stared in horror as the brown lump that had been Euphemia grew smaller and smaller. When it was about 3 inches high, it stopped shrinking and put out large webbed feet. On these webbed feet it crawled forward and stared at them reproachfully out of protruding yellowish eyes near the top of its head. "Oh dear," said Kat. It seemed that Gwendolyn's last act had been to turn Euphemia into a frog. Janet burst into tears. Kat was surprised. She had seemed so self-assured. Sobbing heavily, Janet knelt down and tenderly picked up the brown, crawling Euphemia. "You poor girl," she wept. "I know just how you feel. Kat, what are we to do? How do you turn people back?" "I don't know," Kat said soberly. He was suddenly burdened with huge responsibilities. Janet, in spite of the confident way she talked, clearly needed looking after. Euphemia clearly needed it even more. If it had not been for Chrestomanci, Kat would have raced off to get Mr. Saunders to help that moment. But he suddenly realized that if Chrestomanci ever found out what Gwendolyn had done this time, the most terrible things would happen. Kat was quite sure of this. He discovered that he was terrified of Chrestomanci. He had been terrified of him all along, without realizing it. He knew he would have to keep both Janet and Euphemia a secret somehow. Feeling desperate, Kat raced to the bathroom, found a damp towel and brought it to Janet. "Put her down on this. She'll need to be wet. I'll ask Roger and Julia to turn her back. I'll tell them you won't. And for goodness sake, don't tell anyone you aren't Gwendolyn, please." Janet lowered Euphemia gently onto the towel. Euphemia scrambled around in it and continued to stare accusingly at Janet. "Don't look like that. It wasn't me," Janet said, sniffing. "Kat, we'll have to hide her. Would she be comfortable in the wardrobe?" "She'll have to be," said Kat. "You get dressed." A look of panic came over Janet's face. "Kat, what does Gwendolyn wear?" Kat thought all girls knew what girls wore. "The usual things. Petticoat, stockings, dress, boots, you know." "No, I don't," said Janet. "I always wear trousers."
This ends Disc 3.